Hello everyone, and welcome to the next anime retrospective on OAM. Now, due to personal reasons, I felt like skipping the one-off productions and just getting right into the next series. And for this series of videos, we will be looking at Sunrise's, currently Bandai Namco Filmworks, 1996 production, The Vision of Escaflowne, which I may mispronounce as Escaflowne, or simply refer to as VOE from time to time. Now, before we get into the plot of the series itself, I'd like to speak about the series just a little bit before we get into things. Now, Escaflowne is another great viewer suggestion that I have received, and in fact, it's one of the earliest I received, though I initially did not consider it because I was under the false impression that the series was never completed, because I misread the Wikipedia article on it. This, of course, was a reading error on my part, and the series is in fact well concluded and well loved. And I can see why it is too, as it is a great series, and one I quite enjoyed. The fantastical setting and the characters, combined with an excellent soundtrack and a level-headed protagonist, makes for a great story, especially when we consider that as an earlier isekai, a word with a negative connotation in some circles these days, VOE leaves out a lot of the later gimmicky tropes that people associate with later works. Instead, VOE is a real powerhouse that focuses on its characters growing in a fantastical setting, while still being very human at their core. It's a real powerhouse, it's visually gorgeous, and it's just great entertainment. I will also say that the Vision of Escaflowne was a great breath of fresh air, and while Escaflowne still has serious moments and good character growth and important messages overall, its general tone and look and feel is just a lot more pleasant. The characters are all likable and friendly enough, Hitomi is especially a great protagonist, and interpersonal communication is unusually open and honest. I bring that up because I just watched Evangelion, where it's the exact opposite. Combine this with a whimsical setting and the themes of discovering oneself and one's own heart, and you have an all-around pleasant and universal piece worth your watching. I say universal because I also want to take a second to dismiss any criticism that Escaflowne is, quote, just a chick flick. I mean, yes, the main character is female, but the series is not really aimed towards any one party in general. It's an all-around good story that really anyone I think could enjoy. Yeah, the main character is female, but she never really manifests any real, quote, woman stereotypes, and she's very likable. In fact, I'd consider her a great protagonist, as while supportive of others, she still stands up for herself and her own interests. Hitomi is very self-aware, well-rounded, grounded, and thoughtful, but she's still human enough to be relatable. While romance is a key plot point and theme of the series, and it isn't focused on to the extent where it becomes a detriment to the wider plot of the series, even if it is critical to it. In addition, I'd like to also note that the romance in Escaflowne is handled relatively well for the most part. There are a few issues which we'll look at later. Depending on your own views and experiences, it may not be the most realistic, but everyone is relatively mature about things, and there isn't any real dramatic, soapy moments. I found it quite refreshing that the trope of two male characters having a falling out and fighting over a woman doesn't actually happen. In fact, everyone in the series is pretty good about just taking the L almost in every occasion, and there's quite a few, but it's quite refreshing just seeing people talk about things and just go, well, it is what it is, because sometimes it just is what it is. I'd also like to note that while VOE may be labeled as a chick flick by some people, it has a lot of disparate elements which don't necessarily have an inherent female bias. Fantastical settings, airships, mechs, and mole man, those can appeal to anyone. It's just an all-around good show, and something that I think almost anyone can enjoy. Anyways, with my preamble concluded, let's get into the actual plot of the series. Now, the Vision of Escaflowne centers on the clairvoyant Hitomi Kanzaki, and her travels to the parallel dimension, planet, place, dream, whatever, of Gaia. They say it's a planet, but it's not quite clear. The series opens in Japan, where Hitomi is a member of the school track team, and while practicing track, sees a vision of an odd man fighting a dragon and faints. She later wakes up in the nurse's office, and upon being informed that track captain Amano is leaving soon, she decides to set up a late-night track meet with him in order to confess her feelings. Here, she hopes to beat her personal best in order to get a kiss from her. Amano uses her lucky pendant as a pendulum clock to see if she can beat her personal best of 13 seconds. While she's running, she again sees the man from her earlier visions, who this time manifests in a physical form alongside a dangerous dragon. The man and the dragon fight while Hitomi, her friend Yukari, and Amano all run away. While doing so, however, Hitomi has a vision of the dragon killing the man, and as such runs back to warn the man and in turn saves him. This allows the man to kill the dragon, claim its energist, this orb, and travel home, although he inadvertently takes Hitomi with him. And this sees Hitomi arrive at Gaia, the magical setting for about 99% of the story, that while seemingly medieval, is actually in some ways more advanced than our societies today. In Gaia, she learns that the man she saved is actually Van, or in some dubs, Vaughn, the king of Finalia, who, in return for saving him, promises to get Hitomi back safely. Before he can do so, though, Vaughn must be coronated as the king of Finalia, as by having killed a dragon, he has completed the rite necessary to be considered the king of Finalia, and to also activate Escaflowne, a Gaia a kind of mech prevalent in the series, which is closely tied to both the mystical powers of Gaia and Vaughn's own royal lineage. During the coronation, however, Finalia is attacked and burned to the ground by the forces of the Zybok Empire, led by the bloodthirsty Lord Dillandau and the grim, somber Lord Folken. While the civilians are evacuated and Vaughn intends to fight on, he is convinced to flee alongside Hitomi as Finalia burns. They are almost captured, though do make a last-second escape which sees the two get separated. This magical escape seems to be the manifestation of Hitomi's latent psychic powers, and these powers assist her greatly throughout the series in the forms of precognitions, dowsing, future sight, and some other useful abilities which from time to time even include teleportation. Having been separated from Vaughn, Hitomi is discovered by Alan Schezar, who proceeds to rescue her and take her to an outpost of the Kingdom of Astoria, and he also looks astonishingly like a mono, which Hitomi does notice. At this outpost, she reunites with Vaughn, who informs Alan of Finalia's fate. So a follow-up attack by Zalbach on the outpost convinces Alan that he needs to help him, and Hitomi reach the King of Asturias in order to seek justice for what has occurred. This sees the group flee in the Crusade, an airship belonging to Alan, although they are intercepted and Vaughn is even briefly captured. While he is rescued by Alan and Hitomi, he spends enough time in captivity to learn that Folken is actually his brother, who failed to kill a dragon, and he also manages to literally scar Dillandau for life. Upon reaching Asturias, Alan is reunited with Millerna, a princess who, while in love with him, is unaware of the fact that Alan used to love her sister and kind of leads her on, and a princess who also loathes her status as a royal with no real power. Upon reaching the king, Alan's request for justice against the Zalbach is denied, as the king is realistically aware of the fact that he lacks the power needed to right the wrongs that have occurred, and just kind of has Vaughn and Hitomi lie low for a while. While Hitomi resigns herself to the fact that Alan is already claimed by, and seems to be somewhat interested in Millerna, Dillandau again strikes, and Vaughn and Hitomi are ultimately forced to leave the kingdom after being discovered. In addition, for having helped the wanted man, Alan is arrested. While Alan sits around in jail, Vaughn and Hitomi raid a Zybok mining operation, though it doesn't go according to plan, and Vaughn uses his wings to rescue Hitomi. This reveals himself to be the angel that she has seen in some of her visions. It turns out that Vaughn is half Draconian, the so-called cursed race of Atlantis, and thus has wings. Anyways, the two reunite with Alan on the way to the Duchy of Freld, or Fried in the dub, to warn the Duke of Fried of an impending Zybok attack, and Hitomi and Van were subconsciously doing the same as they were following Hitomi's dousing intuition. A skirmish occurs and Alan is seriously wounded, though he is saved by Millerna, who happened to run away, happened to be on the same convoy that Vaughn and Alan and Hitomi run into, and happened to have studied medicine in the past. Once in Freld, the now core cast warns the prince, who in turn vouches for them after some doppelganger shenanigans sees them wrongly incarcerated. Between this and the big battle, Millerna also learns that the prince is actually Alan's secret son, and that Alan scored with her now dead sister. This does have repercussions later. Anyways, Zalbach forces enter Freld, torch the capital, and force the Duke and the main cast to flee to the Fortuna Temple. This temple is a power spot, and home to the power of Atlantis, which the Duke and Prince ultimately have to yield to Zybok after being beaten to a pulp. This sees the main cast forced to run away again, and Vaughn seriously hurt again, as it turns out that he and Escaflowne are bound by blood and reflect damage upon each other. Luckily, they also happen to run into Dryden, Millerna's wealthy, arranged fiancé, who knows how to summon a repair team and then has enough money to also pay for said repairs. Feeling much better, but angry, Vaughn then proceeds to go out and kill all of Dillandau's knights in the ensuing struggle, which finally breaks Dillandau for a while, causing him to have a severe mental breakdown. In light of this, he is taken by some sorcerers back to the Zybok capital to be, quote, experimented upon. Dryden then joins the cast and resolves to discover the lost secret of Atlantis, both in order to fulfill his own personal curiosity and to kind of see what the crew should do next. The group then heads to the Mystic Valley in order to discover the secret of Atlantis and end up followed by Zalbak forces. It turns out, though, that even though Zybok has the power spot, they still need Van and Hitomi, as when together they can upset fate, and therefore upset the Emperor's ambitions, which we'll get to later. With Hitomi's pendant, the group inadvertently manages to open a portal to Atlantis, and each of the three main casts has a series of revelations bestowed upon them. Alan learns of his father's past. Now this father of his kind of walked out on Alan and his mother, which in turn greatly scarred Alan and led him to have a great amount of resentment for him. The reason he did so was, in fact, to pursue the secret of Atlantis, as he had seen Hitomi's grandmother, an earlier Earthling who had been kind of teleported to Gaia under similar mysterious circumstances. While her grandmother doesn't necessarily have a big role in the series, it is just a weird, interesting connection. Vaughn, on the other hand, has a revelation where he is forced to confront his own hesitancy of battle, his own fear of fighting, as even though brave, he still has the inherent fear that many of us have when it comes to confrontation. This is kind of him coming to terms with his own hesitancy to both rule and lead, and his process of becoming a more mature leader. Hitomi, on the other hand, gets scolded by a dead woman for using tarot cards. This one's a weird one, as yes, it does say that Hitomi needs to make her own fate as opposed to trying to predict fate, but it's kind of clunkily handled, and it just kind of seems like she's getting nagged after having carried the team for, a good few many engagements as it was. The group then ends up in Atlantis, where Hitomi needs to rescue Alan and Van from their own psychic visions. Some more magicking ensures, and the three main cast are then teleported to Emperor Dornkirk's lab, which contains his fate altercation engine, or prognostication engine, or there's several names for it. Dornkirk is the leader of the Zybok Empire, and explains his backstory and goal of controlling destiny itself. He wants to create a world free of conflict by physically controlling destiny, as at least to him it's a physical force which can be scientifically understood with enough experimentation and research. While his desire to create a, quote, happy destiny for everyone sounds okay, if not good, his methods and how he goes about things are not, and it's obvious that he's not a very warm man. Not much else happens while in Zybok's capital, and the trio eventually break out and reunite with the secondary cast back in Astoria. Dornkirk now knows that he must keep Hitomi and Vaughn's secret in order to achieve his ideal fate, as he knows that for some reason when they're together they have the power to make their own fate, and therefore disrupt his plans of creating an artificial fate to satisfy everyone. He thus turns on his machine, and thus literally manipulates fate to have Alan and Hitomi fall in love. Vaughn kind of sees this, and does take the L quite well, resigning himself to trusting Alan with Hitomi's care. Meanwhile, Millerna's arranged marriage to Dryden does go through, and ultimately gets crashed by Folken and his cat assassins, who seem to kind of be a substitute for Dillandau, after Dillandau, of course, is carted off. Hitomi surrenders herself to stop the attack, feeling guilty for consciously not warning the group of the dangers of the wedding, although she is ultimately released and witnesses Folken's fortress explode. Inside, Folken is disgusted by Dornkirk's lack of empathy, and finally reasons to abandon him. This sees him ultimately team up with Vaughn, and helps assemble a coalition to oppose Zybok. Several battles are fought, and Hitomi has to psychically witness one through her connection with Vaughn. The carnage and brutality are so shocking to her that she ends up teleporting herself back home for a bit and kind of reliving the days leading up to the first episode, and reflecting upon both herself and what she wants in life. She now knows that she doesn't quite know what she wants, and that Yukari is the one who really loved Amano the whole time. She decides instead to put her friend first, and then questions what to do. As she does, a tarot card blows over, and she realizes what she really wants is Vaughn. As such, she does make sure to return the Gaia and help him out, through the power of thought. Yes, this is how it is explained in the story. In the story, it's explained that she and Vaughn are so strongly connected that when they both think about each other, it's enough to warp one over to the other side. Oh yeah, Dillandau is actually Alan's brainwashed sister, who Dornkirk kidnapped and tested out, quote, fate alteration experiments upon. This doesn't really do much for the rest of the series, but it is an interesting revelation, and a twist that, I will admit, it got me. It even makes Dillandau kind of relatable, which is impressive considering how unlikable he was in most of his appearances up until this point. Anyways, Gaia is now enveloped by war, and Hitomi decides to confront Dornkirk personally alongside Folken. Folken does kill Dornkirk, although he dies in the process, which upsets Hitomi enough, which ends up activating the Fate Altercation device. While Dornkirk said this device should make a happy world, what it does is that it just makes everyone bloodthirsty as they give in to their own brutal desires. And Dornkirk just kind of stands in the background as a ghost and goes, well, I guess humanity sucks, resigning himself to the, quote, undesirable traits of humanity. Due to the nature of the Destiny Machine, even Vaughn and Alan are driven to fight each other. Alan trying to protect Selena, formerly Dillandau, whom Vaughn is now bent on killing. Hitomi, however, telepathically calms Vaughn down, who is in the midst of this fighting. Vaughn, in turn, flies away to her, and in the process gathers feathers which calm everyone down, while Alan smiles and accepts the fact that Vaughn is the one that she truly loves. The war ends, and the long rebuilding ceremony begins. In the final scenes, Vaughn and Hitomi confess their feelings for each other, and that while Hitomi must go home, the two take solace in the fact that they can see each other whenever they want by simply thinking about each other, and that they will always be in each other's hearts. All in all, the Vision of Escaflowne is quite a ride, and a great one at that. While the plot does move kind of fast, and it may seem a little dense here and there when explained in this kind of way, when actually watched, its pacing works surprisingly well. It moves fast enough to keep up one's interest and the tension in the series, while still taking time for personal scenes and character development. In addition, in a world where magic is normal and not everything is fully explained, a lot of the episodes, at least the earlier ones, do a good amount of setup and payoff. Something seemingly inconsequential may happen, although this often provides a payoff for an important event later. Yes, it is fair to say that the series isn't perfect, but most of its flaws lie in logistical issues outside of the core points or the core cast of the series. The most prominent issue is some of the romance which takes place in the story, as the love triangle between Vaughn, Hitomi, and Alan is kind of weird when we take ages into consideration, and while it did make me a little uncomfortable, thinking about it, the optics of it are not very good for Alan, and it does make scenes like this kind of weird, which, they did make me a little uncomfortable. However, I would also like to note that Hitomi and Vaughn are actually the same age, so that's not that weird. It's just that the optics of the age dynamic don't make Alan look very good, although I would also like to point out that Dornkirk literally manipulated fate to make this happen, so it is implied that this isn't necessarily a natural outcome, and both characters do seem to be somewhat aware of that, though they do lend themselves to a few unintentionally uncomfortable moments. I understand it's supposed to be like a young woman fantasizing about a literal knight in shining armor. However, when you take the actual optics and logistics of things into consideration, it doesn't look that good. I don't think this was something that the writers intentionally did. I think this is just one of those oversights that ends up in a Japanese fantasy piece. I don't think they were really thinking about the logistics of things, and of course, their flaws and logistics are different, of course, but that doesn't change the fact that the optics of certain scenes are a little uncomfortable, although again, Hitomi and Vaughn are the same age, and this series actually has very little fan service, so it could have been a lot worse. Now, I will be the first to admit I don't quite understand all the mythological laws controlling Gaia, or how Dornkirk built a machine to control destiny, or how all the magic works, or if there's any set magic laws, or if everything operates on an ad hoc basis, or a lot of things, in all honesty. There are some logistical issues present in the series. However, these are relatively minuscule, and while I did from time to time ask, how does that work? It was never a big deal because A, the series is one where magic is a thing and divining is a thing, as well as psychic powers, so I have no problem with the series going, well, it's magic, a few times. It doesn't do it enough to the point where it's an issue, so a few times I'm fine with. And B, the logistics aren't the core of the story, so them being a little inconsistent here and there don't really ruin it for me. The only other issue I guess you could say I noticed with the series was how its core messages get a little muddled here and there. Now, the core ideas of pacifism and creating one's own destiny and accepting the facts on the ground are all fine, but sometimes the show handles them in a way that isn't always optimal. Sometimes they are handled in a little bit of a clunky manner. For example, Hitomi gets scolded for using fortune-telling in line with the theme of creating one's destiny. This makes sense, as the show is telling the viewer, through Hitomi, to be more proactive and to make positive life changes to affect a positive future, instead of passively relying on a possible future. It's a warning against passively slipping into an unhappy destiny by simply assuming that destiny is pre-made. This is a good message. However, sometimes it isn't always handled 100% consistently or well. While VOE does say that fear can create bad self-fulfilling prophecies, the way it does so doesn't necessarily make sense. It doesn't say that Hitomi fortune-telling resigns herself to passivity, but instead that doing so literally changes fate. In addition, Hitomi is specifically told that she should trust her feelings and try to change her own destiny any way she can. However, when she does so, it kind of backfires a few times, in spite of all that she's been told up until that point. In addition, while the generic theme of war is bad, is a good theme to promote, I'm not going to disagree with it, how it's handled is also a little clunky. While Zybox War to Stop War is a good showing of the hypocrisy of violence, people getting berated for self-defense in literal life or death situations isn't the best. There are some points where the series does come off as a little preachy or clunky in regards to this theme, although these are limited enough to where they're basically inconsequential. Again, the core idea is sound, so even if the execution's a little clunky, it's not a deal breaker. They don't distract from the core of the series, and the core of the story is in fact Hitomi, and her own development and discoveries. And she's written in a way that makes this work excellently. Her writing and the writing of the rest of the cast is by far good enough to make me overlook a few confusing happenings every now and again. They're written very well, they're all quite likable, and again, they're all quite mature, really. So these few issues with the Japanese version of the series don't really bother me. I specify Japanese subtitled version because the dubs have their own little quirks, which I'll mention in a bit. Another thing that's its own little quirk is the Vision of Escaflowne movie. It's kind of a sort of retelling, but not really, of the original series, with some very big differences. It has drastically different characterization, character designs, and tone. And for that reason, it's both very jarring and very fascinating to watch. In the movie, Folken is the main antagonist, and the characters of Hitomi and Van are slightly different, although it does still look gorgeous. The plot also deviates in many major points, although its ending is kind of similar, I guess. While the movie is perfectly capable of standing up on its own, having just watched it after having watched the entire 26-episode series, it just feels a little bit off to me. It's just so different in terms of tone and plot and characterization that it's a fascinating, weird little thing. Again, while the movie is fine, I love the original series so much that upon watching the movie afterwards, it just felt a tad off. Now this of course is a statement of my own bias, as I simply prefer the original series, and it's not an insult to the movie. In fact, I found the movie quite fascinating, although it does feel quite off going from the mostly generic positive of the series to the very dark and visceral tone of the movie. It is fascinating to me, and I personally like it, although if you don't because of how drastically different it is from the series, and how it kind of, I don't want to say disrespects, but maybe disregards some of the original series messages and tones and characters, I can understand why people don't like this movie, as it's so different, it doesn't even feel like something based on the series of Escaflowne. I mean, the movie's good. It just means that the movie is very different from the series, and that I won't really touch on it from this point on in the retrospective, as it's kind of outside of the scope of it. What will be within the scope of this retrospective, and touched on though, is the different dubs of Escaflowne. Now as mentioned earlier, I wanted to speak on the dubs for a second. Escaflowne has a few dubs, some of which more notable than others. Originally, the series was distributed in the West as a subtitled piece, although an English dub for it was made by Ocean in around the year 2000. This dub did have a few development issues. It went on to become the default dub and was actually quite good, even if it is a little dated from time to time. I say this because it is clear that every now and again the actors don't always have the best direction, and sometimes it seems like they might be a little confused. It is a very good dub though, and all the characters sound like you would expect them to. I've seen it both dubbed and subtitled, and I think either version is good. Something that not everyone may agree with is good though is what Fox Kids ended up doing to this dub. You see, while the Ocean dub is on many DVDs of the series, and was even broadcast in some areas, for some reason, it was also broadcast in an edited format by Fox Kids, who modified the dub for, their own purposes to create their own version of the series. This version of the show was quite edited, and made some drastic changes. These edits went well beyond normal dubbing issues and some audio ADR stuff here and there, and it resulted in a very unique creation, which downplayed Hitomi's role, tried to frame Vaughn as the main character of the series, cut out a lot of scenes, added, quote, recap scenes, and even modified the OST, greatly altering the original show. Although, I will admit that those modified songs are still catchy. This dub was certainly unique, and while the dubbing itself was still the Ocean version of it, this series, or this iteration of Escaflowne, was so edited that, depending on who you ask, it was somewhere between pretty cool in a cheesy way, or garbage. Opinions vary. And it wasn't very successful in terms of ratings. It was, though, an early anime piece for many, though, and I respect it for that. I don't want to dunk on it too hard, as, again, Fox Kids did what Fox Kids did, and they took a series and modified it. It did introduce many people to a great series, though, and I'm not gonna knock it for that. It's just an interesting curiosity. Also, it had probably one of the most hyped Fox Kids trailers I've ever seen. This is pretty dope. Finally, in 2016, a new dub was released by Funimation after a Kickstarter campaign, and this resulted in an additional dub with a whole new cast. I haven't seen this dub, although I've heard it's good. While each of these dubs has their own charms, for the sake of this retrospective, I'm using a subtitled version of the series for both consistency's sake and because I happen to own a subtitled version on DVD. All in all, though, I think I love the Vision of Escaflowne, as it's simply a great story with a great cast. Its whimsical and magical setting pair excellently with a humbled and grounded cast who are easy to get along with and sympathize with. Escaflowne is simply great, and its setting and its story and its characters recreate a magical setting which are just so easy to fall into. I don't think I've felt this whimsically swept off my feet since I've seen a Studio Ghibli movie. Now, this isn't a Ghibli movie or production. Miyazaki has nothing to do with the series. I just say that to really hype up how engrossing the series is and how kind of unique it felt, at least to me. It just feels so magical. Sure, the plot may be a tad muddled here and there, sure, some of the messages are a tad muddled here and there, and the cast may not be completely, quote, realistic, but they, and the setting, and the soundtrack, and just the magic of the series really make it a great obscure anime memory. It makes it a series which stands out so easily upon itself. In fact, some go on to consider it one of the, quote, most animes of all time, because of all the weird things that it incorporates, and how it somehow makes it all work. Please join me as I explore this amazing, obscure anime memory. With the plot and my opening thoughts on the series discussed, it's time we look at where the story actually takes place, the mystical world of Gaia. With a few shots on Earth, of course. Now, Gaia is a fascinating setting, and through this look at it, I hope to discuss why it is so, and how it expertly complements and sets the stage for the characters and tones at the very core of the series. Now, the Vision of Escaflowne takes place in the magical world of Gaia, and Gaia is an excellent setting for a variety of reasons, both superficial and more deep. On a surface level, Gaia is simply a great setting because of how visually inviting it is. Its vast variety of colors and settings draw us in as we want to see more of what this world consists of, whether it's abandoned temples, thick jungles, or large cities. We are intrigued by what we don't know, and there's so much about Gaia that we don't know that we're kind of drawn in. Its bright surface colors in different realms welcome us and let us know that there is a grand adventure which is about to unfold before us. They let us know that Gaia is an extensive land full of many different states and peoples and societies, and much more. From the Venice-inspired city of Pallas, to the Asian-themed duchy of Freld, to the seemingly German Bosram, the many realms of Gaia all have their own feel, and the varieties of feels around creates a world which seems more than just inspired by a single place. A world that, while fantastical, sort of mirrors our own in its variety and layers. And while many realms are not very fleshed out or merely mentioned, the sheer amount of realms and places hinted at helps create a feeling that the world of Gaia is truly an extensive and vast one. All of this variety both engages us visually and plants the seeds of curiosity which pull us in further, setting the stage for an exploration of the deeper layer of why Gaia is such a great setting. On a deeper layer, Gaia is a magnificent setting for the series because of how it and the cast contrast each other so well and in turn strengthen each other. While Gaia is a fantastical place full of countless wonders and realms and mystical things, it's also a place full of normal people and societies, full of characters that we can both relate to and empathize with, that we can understand and see existing in our own world. And it's also full of many different states of different statures engaged in their own political maneuvering, just like our world. While the land of Gaia itself is quite magical and fantastical, many of the people and states present are not. And the many wars, conflicts, and political intrigues present let us know that A, the cast should be taken seriously, and B, this isn't just some lighthearted adventure with no meaning, that this is an adventure which will reflect upon deeper human emotions and thoughts, and that will have a meaningful impact upon us. This juxtaposition between a magical Gaia full of psychic powers and mysteries, and a grounded cast of characters in turn strengthens both the fantastical nature of the setting and the grounded nature of the cast and states present. that they are so different points out why they are both so strong and memorable, all the while lending a sense of credibility to both. Yes, Gaia is impossibly fantastical, but that its people and regimes are not makes it seem as though Gaia could be something that could happen. Since it has realistic and people and realms, we are convinced to overlook some of the inconsistencies of the setting and to ignore how fantastical it is. In a sense, the realistic nature of the realms and peoples present help establish our suspension of disbelief. Meanwhile, the fantastic and magical air of the setting lends an air of wonder to a cast who is pretty grounded in all actuality. It imbues realistic characters with an air of the extraordinary by being magical in and of itself, and it being so alien also allows for Hitomi to feel like a fish out of water. On the topic of Hitomi, her interactions with the setting are also of note, as they alternatively lend her character an air of both tragedy and excitement, depending on what her most recent interaction is. The tragedy, of course, comes from her separation from her home and what she knows, and her anxiety to return to them. She is burdened by being thrust into a brand new and alien world, which is so bizarre and extensive. However, this level of novelty also gives rise to certain levels of excitement, as Hitomi grows fond of Gaia and discovering its many neat people and trinkets. In a way, Hitomi and her interactions with the setting kind of mirror our own, as we navigate the emotional twists and turns of this grand adventure. Assisting all of these emotional impacts are an amazing soundtrack, which complement the series almost perfectly. Once again, the works of the legendary Yoko Kanno, and a few other works by Hajime Mizuguchi, create a wondrous complement to the events unfolding on the screen. VOE's OST is without a doubt one of the best I've heard in a long while, and its clean, orchestral sound and limited use of vocals mesh almost perfectly with their settings. While there's nothing wrong with any series using an orchestral soundtrack, the fantasy element present lends an extra bit of connective tissue to it, as the timbre of many of its pieces connect themselves very well to the notion of noble kingdoms, magical realms, and medieval fantasies. Many of them feel like songs you could actually see being played in the world of Gaia itself, by say a group of court musicians. In addition, the heavy use of orchestral pieces makes the limited use of vocal pieces all the more impactful in times of high tension or impact. There are very few moments in the series where a sort of music video takes place with vocalized music. However, their rarity makes them much more impactful, as they're out of place enough to be noticed and to take precedent, but not enough to the point where it's distracting. I'd also like to point out the song played at the very end of the series, which is fittingly called Ending Theme, as it is one of the most moving pieces in all of anime, especially when used in the context of the one shot it's actually meant for. This single 5-minute piece should be listened to, as it basically encapsulates the entirety of the series, a magical and mysterious journey which moves us emotionally, in addition to whatever physical travels take place. A journey which not only takes place in a magical realm, but explores the human heart and its own deep feelings. In short, the OST is a very strong one in this series, and it goes beyond complementing the imagery and filling dead air. Instead, the OST of Vision of Escaflowne is a masterpiece in and of itself, and it's strong enough to elicit some kind of emotional response regardless of whatever shot it's used against in the screen. On the topic of shots, I also wanted to take a quick moment to comment on the amount of scenes which take place in this series at dawn, dusk, twilight, or night. While I think a majority of the series takes place during day, somewhere from 51 to 70%, there are many shots which don't. There are many shots which take place during the late night or the early morning, and this also lends itself to the dreamlike nature of the series, as people tend to sleep at night. The sheer amount of night shots not only look gorgeous, but are also a sort of way of lulling the viewer into embracing the dreamlike nature of the Vision of Escaflowne, and to inform us that we are no longer in the ordinary world. We see this every time we see the Earth in the sky, alongside another moon. We see this every time Hitomi looks into the stars and tells us that they have the power to grant wishes. We see this every time the sun rises in the series, as it rises upon a new land that we're unfamiliar with. Even in the ordinary world, which Hitomi comes from, many, if not most of the shots are set at night or early morning times. In fact, it even goes full circle, as Hitomi enters Gaia for the first time at night in episode 1, symbolizing a sort of entrance into a dream, and exits Gaia in the morning, it seems, as the very last shot of the series shows her in the early morning, showing a sort of waking from a dream. And a dream is a great way to sort of describe the setting of Gaia, the setting of the Vision of Escaflowne itself, the soundtrack of the series, and the emotions they help elicit. As, while the setting may not make 100% sense in a logistical sense, as some stuff does happen which isn't fully explained, it's still fully engrossing and fascinating. Like a dream, it is a realm whose surface-level fantasy elements complement our own inner emotions, our own inner feelings. It is a dream whose surface-level fantasy elements also complement a grounded and likable cast, which in turn strengthens both because of how contrasting they are. It is a dream of wonder, and a dream come true. Seeing as that we've already looked at the plot and setting of the series, it's time we start diving into some of the characters. And for this task, we're going to start with the character who seems to have the least amount of character. That is, the least amount of humanity. He is well written. And that is Emperor Dornkirk. To start though, we must briefly look over Dornkirk's place in the story. Dornkirk first appears in episode 2 in a little virtual meeting he has with the Lords Folken and Dillandau. While he only says a few words in this meeting, it does a good job of kind of setting him up as a distant and mysterious overseer who instructs Lord Folken to carry out his agenda, which we gradually piece together over time. We learn that his agenda is to reawaken the power of Atlantis, that is the power to turn thoughts into power, and use it to reshape fate. To do so, Dornkirk must power up his destiny alteration machine, and this requires the neutralization of the dragon, that is Von and Escaflowne, obtaining the power spot present in the Duchy of Feld, and later the abilities of Hitomi. Through later flashbacks about Alan's father, we also learn that Dornkirk's real name is Isaac, and that he traveled with Alan's father for a while. The two never seem that close, although Dornkirk does share his real name, that is Isaac, and that he's actually from Earth. On a quick side note, it's unconfirmed, but heavily implied throughout the series, that Dornkirk is actually the real-life scientist of Isaac Newton, who did get up to some occult activities later in his life. We don't actually meet Emperor Dornkirk though in person until about the halfway point in the series, when Alan, Von, and Hitomi get teleported to the capital of the Zybok Empire. It is here that Dornkirk finally gives us his backstory and spells out his goals. Dornkirk was originally a scientist from Earth, who in addition to his scientific studies also carried out studies on the nature of destiny. In his mind, destiny itself was a natural force that could be observed, measured, and maybe even one day manipulated. Something akin to, say, magnetism. In spite of all of his experiments, though, he grew older and older without ever getting any answers, and this haunted him so much that he inadvertently slipped away into the land of Gaia. In Gaia, Dornkirk stumbled upon a small group of people, constantly beset by hunger and adversaries. Taking pity on them, he taught them how to use technology, which allowed them to develop and eventually evolve into Zybok, the preeminent power of Gaia. With an empire now at his disposal, Dornkirk seeks to use its resources to perfect the alteration of fate, and use it to create a happy, albeit artificial, fate for everyone. Even after the group escapes from Dornkirk's lair, the Emperor seems resolute in his goal, and continues to pursue this goal as he now seeks to keep Von and Hitomi separated, as it seems that when they are together, they have the power to alter fate. To keep them separated, he eventually gives the green light to alter fate and to set up Hitomi with Alan, and this for the time being does seem to be relatively effective. All the while, he is also seemingly unconcerned about the fate of his own followers, something which eventually pushes Folken to betray him. Even as the Alliance and Zybok soldiers start to cross blades, he's apathetic to whatever's going on the ground, as to him it isn't really important. It doesn't affect him at least, or at least until Folken and Hitomi teleport to him to stop his plans. To this end, Folken quickly kills Dornkirk even after Dornkirk's amazing reveal scene, although this upsets Hitomi, who ends up activating the fate alteration device. This does not work as intended though, and simply exacerbates the violence on the battlefield. Dornkirk comes back as a ghost to lament this, and even muses that conflict seems to be the inevitable state of humanity, an inevitable fate. As Von rushes to Hitomi though, and inadvertently ends the conflict, Dornkirk starts to fade away, after making one last musing on how maybe the power to change fate was in the human heart all along. Now, Dornkirk is a fascinating character because of how little character he seems to have. That's not a knock on his writing or his place on the series, it's instead to say that the main antagonist seems literally inhuman. It seems as though he was written to have as little humanity as possible, good or bad. He instead comes off as more of an eldritch horror, or a sort of cosmic force that is so above the human mind or comprehension that it's detached from it in a sort of way. This even makes him more intimidating, as he comes off as a sort of force of nature, and not just some guy. While Dornkirk is human, and does have obviously human traits like his passions, in his case for science, possible empathy, he does seem to have a noble goal on the surface level, and his own search for meaning, in this case his search to define destiny, he has been so lost in his obsessive quest that his humanity seems to have atrophied. The great irony here is that the man who sought to control destiny itself for the benefit of others has doomed many in his cold quest to shape fate. He has become as cold and disconnected as the seemingly uncaring universe itself. In an even more ironic twist, all of this has caused his heart to shrivel up and atrophy, his emotions to be discarded, and these are the things which go on to prove to have the ability to alter fate, to motivate humans to surpass their boundaries and change destiny, to take hold of their own agency and make a better future. He has become a cold and uncaring cosmic force, the very thing he sought to control, something that is seemingly ambivalent or unaware of the idea of morality, and instead simply affects others as a byproduct of its own natural processes. Dornkirk's morality, or lack thereof, makes him a fascinating villain, as while he isn't particularly likable, it's also hard to say he's malevolent. On the surface, you could even argue that he's kind of a good guy, as it's no doubt he helped the troubled people of Zybok prosper, and again, on the surface, it's hard to deny that the idea of trying to make everyone happy is good. And it does genuinely seem like he wants to do this, like he wants to end conflict. Again, though, that doesn't make him likable, and he's very inhuman. While he doesn't show himself to be malevolent, he also shows himself to be quite disconnected at best, and condescending and controlling at worst. He clearly doesn't value individual life, and the pursuit of his goal has killed and maimed many out of simple scientific curiosity and/or an overwhelming desire to control. Although his idea of controlling fate for the benefit of others does sound positive, it's inherently negative as it strips away the agency of others having control over their own destiny. By taking away the limited ability to alter fate from the individual, he in a sense is enslaving them to whatever fate he comes up with. Even if that fate is pleasant, it's an artificial one, as it is one that he has constructed for someone else, something that which they have not worked on, and something that they might not even really want. He seems to have lost his empathy, though, and to him, it doesn't really matter what others want, as to him, his quest is a net good that can justify and outweigh any methods used to accomplishment. Dornkirk's seemingly noble goal of ending war is cast against the appalling methods he uses to achieve this goal, which even include war itself. This sets him up as someone who has either completely severed themselves from any kind of empathetic morality in a misguided quest for the greater good at best, or a narcissist trying to play God at worst. We can even see this juxtaposition of his goals and his methods, of his caring intention with his complete lack of care for others, in his relationships with his two top subordinates, Folken and Dillandau. In a way, both are products of Dornkirk's goal, and both suffer for it in the long run, all of this in spite of their high titles and powers bestowed upon them. While Dornkirk did save Folken's life, and for at least a bit seemed to give him some kind of purpose, he also seemed to have done so simply out of practical means. It seems that Dornkirk saved Folken to follow his own goals. He didn't save Folken the man, so much as try and create Folken the task manager, Folken the executive, Folken the tool. Dillandau's lot is even worse, as Dornkirk did much more harm in this case, abducting a young Selena, and then through fate-altering experiments, creating an unstable, unhappy, and bloodthirsty warlord. At least in Folken's case, Dornkirk did literally save his life, while Dillandau is just sort of an unhappy byproduct of Dornkirk's failed experimentation. While both Folken and Dillandau seemingly have grand titles and powers, neither of them really asked for this fate, and it kind of brings them down in the end. Both of them have a great deal of agency stripped from them for the quote-unquote greater good, and neither of them seems happy with their place in the Empire near the end of the series. Folken obviously defects, and Dillandau obviously reverts back to Selena, although I think it goes without saying that Selena has a much greater chance of being happy than the troubled Dillandau persona. Both of them, Folken and Dillandau, serve as manifestations of the harm that trying to create someone else's fate can bring to that person. They serve as concrete examples of the idea that trying to dictate someone's fate for them, even if it's for the quote-unquote greater good, can have a good deal amount of harm to that person, as at the end of the day, individuals must be allowed to make their own decisions about who they want to be and what they want to do with their life. Dornkirk in the end is even sort of punished by these two for ignoring the idea of human agency. Dillandau's reversion to Selena proves that Dornkirk cannot sustainably physically manipulate fate, and Folken uses his own agency to kill Dornkirk himself. In the end, Dornkirk is trying to pave a road to heaven. However, he's only paving a road to hell, and doing so with his good intentions. The gap of morality between Dornkirk's goal and actions are also used to highlight the central theme of his character. He is the personification of the dangers of discounting the human ability to shape fate, and seeing fate as an unchangeable and unshakable force, if you will. For all of Dornkirk's posturing and grand actions and plans, he seems to have very little faith in humanity and human agency itself. He seeks to change fate itself because he seems to believe that humans in any way cannot, and that they lack any ability to shape their own destinies. He even comes back as a ghost to just kind of gloat about this. He figures that since he cannot directly affect fate from afar, even though he does a couple times, that humans, without as much technology as him or intelligence or whatever resources, cannot do so in any other way. His disconnect has gotten to the point where he discounts human ability and human feelings and emotions and empathy simply because of how alien and insignificant they seem to him. To him, fate is the be-all and end-all, and any human interactions which may have shaped it are simply part of the plan. In fact, I wouldn't even be surprised if he sought to change fate simply because he thought it was his destiny to do so. This is all incredibly ironic, as the man who near single-handedly turned a backwater into a superpower denies the human ability to affect its future and grow in any sort of way on its own. This man, who single-handedly built an empire, denies the ability of humanity to even change fate in the slightest. In a way, Dornkirk's entire character is a criticism of the idea that destiny is set in stone, as his search for destiny itself is nearly what single-handedly destroyed Gaia. He is a critique of the fatalistic fascination with the idea that fate is set in stone, and that therefore humans have no agency to shape it. Because in reality, humans can shape their own destiny, and that while we might not have control over everything, or even many things in our lives, we do have control over some things, and that which we can control can greatly shape the destinies of both ourselves and those around us. Again, ironically, in his quest to accumulate everything to change fate, Dornkirk lost his heart and his empathy, the two things that were proven to be able to change fate. Having just taken a look at the big bad of the series, that of Emperor Dornkirk, I think it's time that we look at his two right-hand lords, that of Dillandau and Folken. We will start this off by dedicating this video to the examination of the character of Lord Dillandau, later revealed to be Selena Schezar, sister of Alan Schezar. Now, Dillandau's character and writing is fascinating to me, as it combines the trope of a brutal enforcer with a few very unconventional elements to create a very unique and memorable persona. When I first met Dillandau, I simply took Dillandau to be the token, bloodthirsty warlord, the person that enjoys combat way too much for their position, and seems to revel in destruction simply for the sake of it. I assumed that Dillandau would solely be a two-dimensional and functional character, one that, while getting the job done, isn't necessarily too deep or complex. And while that is perhaps true to an extent, as Dillandau is not the deepest character in some regards, Dillandau's writing does do a lot with what in most series usually isn't that much of a character. Again, while Dillandau isn't the deepest character, the amount of characterization that is present and the amount of twists and turns that take place during the characterization process make Dillandau a very unique and memorable character, and in fact it's kind of a triumph of the series, as what in most series would be a token, despicable warlord is transformed into a fascinating and perhaps even sympathetic person. I don't know if I would go that far, but it is a very tragic story, and one that even serves as a sort of commentary on the idea of destiny. One that, while following someone who isn't completely fleshed out, obviously has some depth, and obviously has a story to tell. So let's start by looking at that story real quick before going more into the character exploration. Now, Dillandau is introduced in episode 2 as the leader of the Dragon Slayers, an elite team of knights bent on enforcing the will of the Emperor as they see fit. In this role, Dillandau loosely acts as a subordinate of sorts to Folken, carrying out his orders and brutally attacking both target and civilian alike. In fact, one of the defining traits of Dillandau is brutality, and this is evident from his earliest episode 2, as the burning of Finalia was Dillandau's initiative, not one of Folken or Dornkirk. As the series progresses, Dillandau takes part in various attacks and schemes against Vaughn and the main cast, both under and against Folken's direct orders. While Dillandau doesn't necessarily seem to know or care about the greater point of these missions, Dillandau still carries them out with vigor, knowing that it is another chance to fight and perhaps even kill Vaughn. One of the earliest of these actually sees Vaughn captured, though, although he soon escapes, and the escape process sees Vaughn scar Dillandau both literally and figuratively to life. This sets off a chain of events which slowly start to break down Dillandau's fragile sanity, As more failed attacks on Vaughn see Dillandau slide into greater frustration, greater madness, greater brutality, and greater instability. Dillandau is finally mentally broken when, during another attack on Vaughn, the Dragon Slayers are wiped out, and Dillandau basically has a panic attack in the midst of battle at the sight of a charging Escaflowne about to strike the killing blow. While Dillandau does escape the close call, the loss of the Dragon Seers sees Dillandau slip into loneliness, as upon the realization that everyone has left, everyone is dead, now alone, Dillandau slips into this loneliness and soon into a crippling mental stupor. In order to fix this, Dillandau is taken away by court sorcerers for further, quote-unquote, fate modification, and is not seen for a while, although Alan's sister Selena, who's been gone for the entirety of it up until this point, does start to make a few random appearances. It is during one of these that she suddenly snaps, and it is revealed that Dillandau is actually an artificial and or altered persona forced upon Selena as part of a fate altercation experiment carried out by Emperor Dornkirk. It turns out that when Selena was very young, she was kidnapped by Zybok forces and warped into the Lord Dillandau. Only the friendly Jujuka sees Selena/Dillandau somehow make it through all of this brutal experimentation, and now as a knight, Jujuka rejoins Dillandau for a few last missions, both out of a sense of loyalty and out of a desire to protect the fragile psyche of both Selena and Dillandau. With the brutal Dillandau persona once again in full control, Dillandau takes place in a few more battles against Alan and Vaughn, although isn't quite victorious in any way. In fact, in the last of these, Vaughn finally gives in to rage and almost kills a defenseless Dillandau, though only kills a Jujuka who dies protecting Dillandau and ordering, quote, to bring back that sweet Selena. Jujuka's words finally seem to bring back Selena for good, although Vaughn doesn't notice and still tries to kill her. Alan steps in to protect his sister, though, and this leads to the final fight between the two. A fight which luckily ends in no deaths. Finally, with the end of the series, it is shown that Selena has more or less become herself again and seems to be living happily with her brother. Getting into the examination of Dillandau's character, it is one which in all honesty is not too deep, but does quite a bit with what's given to create an interesting character, a character that is much more interesting than what the archetype should have been. The writers did a very good job in creating a character with layers, and then slowly peeling them back in a way that kept Dillandau relevant not only for the sake of the plot, but also for the curiosity of the viewer. Dillandau never feels boring, and it always feels like there's something else to discover until the final revelation is made. Initially, Dillandau is set up as simply the muscle, the person Folken turns to get the dirty work taken care of, and to enforce Zybok's demands. In line with this, Dillandau is initially shown to be quite brutal and arrogant, which are common traits for an enforcer of this nature. Dillandau has little patience for any kind of questioning, and seems to be a narcissist, displaying a dismissive attitude towards almost everyone, even the Dragon Slayers, which, while valued in some sense, are not in any way totally respected. This very early picture of Dillandau is that of a character that, while a little cut and paste, nonetheless fills the role of a brutal enforcer very well, and does seem quite human, albeit a very bad human. As time progresses though, and a few setbacks are incurred upon Dillandau, we soon start to see that underneath the surface level of brutality and arrogance, there is an inherent sense of frustration, of inner insecurity and instability, and these haunting forces soon grow over time and hamper many efforts of Dillandau to remain solely professional, unlike say Folken. On the topic of the two's interactions, I find that they do make good foils to each other, as they have completely opposite views and approaches, yet maintain a sort of, if not respectful, then functioning relationship with each other. Folken is obviously the boss here, but he never belittles Dillandau's mental health. In fact, he does seem to pity him a little, even if he does belittle the enforcer's brutal methods. Dillandau, on the other hand, does seem impatient with Folken and does belittle him a bit from time to time, but with a few exceptions, generally respects his authority and seems to understand that Folken knows what he's doing and is in charge. The two work well together in both the story and a storytelling sense because their differences flesh each other out. They never compete with each other for the attention of the viewer because they're such radically different characters. This establishes an interesting working relationship which is neither too friendly or toxic. It is a relationship which, in spite of Dillandau's tendency to get carried away, seems relatively respectful, or at least professional. I would also like to note that it is possible that Folken knew or knew of Selena/Dillandau for a while before we see them on screen, as a possible Folken shows up for a few frames in episode 25 or 26, trying to prevent Selena from being taken by sorcerers for fate experiments in a flashback. If it really is Folken, it would explain a lot of his probable pity on Dillandau and why he seems to be pretty patient with him, as it seems that he does know that Dillandau was an unfortunate product of a cruel experiment, and he did even try to protect Selena, it seems. This might also explain why Dillandau seems to harbor not quite respect, but more respect for Folken than anyone else, it seems. Going back to the primal frustration and rage expressed by Dillandau, it soon becomes obvious that while Dillandau directs rage and insecurity towards Vaughn and Alan, it did not solely originate from the wound Vaughn inflicted. There seems to be something gnawing away at Dillandau, but all we can initially figure is that Dillandau despises losing and being alone. The losing part does make sense for a brutal warlord. It's a common trope that someone who believes might is right hates losing because it proves that they're not right. The fear of loneliness, however, is something that is not inherent to this archetype, and it's the first humanizing trait assigned to Dillandau, that while not initially giving rise to a lot of viewer sympathy or concern, does give rise to some curiosity. We can see that Dillandau does have some kind of warped or broken humanity, that there is something underneath the monster. This curiosity only grows as Dillandau grows more and more unstable, and the fate alteration experiments are brought up. And it is these experiments, and Dillandau's true identity, which cap off a fascinating writing approach to the character. While one is entitled to think whatever they want about the twist reveal that Dillandau is an altered Selena, I think most people can agree that the twist is such a random one, it cannot be really foreseen. It cannot really be predicted. When I first saw the series, in fact, I did kind of note that Dillandau and Selena looked vaguely familiar, but I confidently told myself there's no way that's the same person. They were probably just running out of design elements or creativity, and thus they look kind of similar. I said there's no way that's the same person. That would be crazy. And yet that's exactly what happened. While some may hate this twist because it does kind of come out of nowhere and seems really out there, I personally like it for that exact reason. Again, you're entitled to your own opinion, but the fact that the writer said, yeah, Selena, Dillandau, they're the same person the whole time, the fact that they did that was one that I found inherently fascinating. Whether or not this makes Dillandau sympathetic or even tragic is left to viewer interpretation again. However, it does, in my experiences, at least do a good job of taking away a lot of hate for the character. Which is very impressive considering that Dillandau is initially written as the sort of character that people love to hate. A brutal enforcer with no human empathy and seemingly no redeeming qualities. And yet, somehow, by the end of the series, I felt no hatred in this regard. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not Selena is responsible for Dillandau's crimes. There are arguments for and against this. But I will say that Dillandau's true identity didn't bother me, and I do really like the insanity of the writing staff just going for the twist. It's a bold step, which I feel I should hate, as it doesn't really make logical sense, and it kinda does come out of nowhere it seems. However, I can't do anything but appreciate this step, as it is something which really showed that the writers wanted to do more with this character, other than creating a simple bloodthirsty enforcer with no real depth. Again, if they stuck with the Dillandau of the earlier episodes, it would have been a competent exercise in the archetype of a bloodthirsty warlord. There would have been nothing wrong with that. However, they wanted to surpass that and kind of put their own mark on that, and thus Dillandau's surprise backstory is sprung upon us. And while Dillandau isn't the most developed character, there is still quite a bit of depth there. As someone who obviously has PTSD and probably some other mental health issues, Dillandau is in a sort of way a victim too. Again, I am in no way absolving Dillandau of any crimes. Dillandau is a horrible person. However, a horrible person with layers and a unique backstory, and probably some health issues. Someone who has obviously been through a lot and didn't seek to be where they currently are. Someone who has been struggling with mental health for quite a while. Someone who obviously needs help, or at least someone to talk to, but cannot go about it in a healthy manner. Someone who is incredibly flawed and takes this out on other people. Someone who hurts others because pain seems to be almost all they know. In fact, all of this trauma suffered by Selena, and probably Dillandau in the creation of the Dillandau persona, might explain a lot of the brutality. It might be one of them, or both of them, simply lashing out against a world that essentially ruined their life for no reason. It could be them lashing out at their fate as an artificial creation of Dornkirk's insane mission to control fate itself. And in a way, it establishes them as a sort of tragic creation as well. Again, if we separate the two characters, while Dillandau's a horrible person, Selena seems to be a very good person whose life was ruined by an unfair and brutal world. On the topic of Dillandau's role concerning the fate of destiny, Dillandau's creation is one of the biggest pieces of evidence pointing towards the idea that fate manipulation is not a good thing, and that the Emperor is not a good person. Dillandau is a sort of manifestation of the dangers of pinning everything on the idea of fate. As someone whose entire life was cruelly manipulated by a madman in the name of trying to control destiny, Dillandau is a good showing of the destructive efforts that this can have on others. An example of why trying to control someone else's fate is probably not good for that other person. Where Dornkirk shows the folly of trying to control others, Dillandau shows the cost that it can have on that person. However, I would also like to note that that's not where the story ends. The story, in fact, ends with Selena seemingly reverting back to herself, in fact, and possibly even going on to live a happy life with Alan. This shows that while destiny may be cruel and it may seem arbitrary from time to time, people can still manipulate it. And the fact that Selena seems to bounce back proves that maybe we all can. With Dillandau's character examined, it's time we focus on Emperor Dornkirk's other main lord, that is, Lord Folken. Now, Folken is a fascinating character, and to an extent, I even question if he's really a proper antagonist, seeing as that he does have a moral compass and seems more to be misguided than evil. In fact, just like his counterpart Dillandau, Folken does a good job of filling an archetypal role, and then surpassing the basic level of complexity needed to do so. While Folken does initially seem to be the simple, cold, calculating member of the duo, his development and characterization greatly surpass this and lend his character an unexpected amount of depth and relatability. In fact, Folken is one of the most fleshed out characters of the entire series, and an excellently written one. His complexity is greatly appreciated, and it is definitely above the bare minimum that was needed. Before we look into all of this though, let's see what Folken actually does in the story. Now, Folken first appears in episode 3, alongside Lord Dillandau. Although where Dillandau is kind of the muscle behind the Emperor's schemes, Folken seems to be the brains. He contacts Dornkirk quite frequently, and carries out various instructions in accordance with the Empire's will. This initially sees him pursue Vaughn, and very early on, him and Lord Dillandau actually succeed in capturing a Lord Vaughn. And this sets up one of the most important interactions between Folken and Vaughn, one which we'll focus on later. Anyways, while in captivity, this interaction takes place, and what it is simply a conversation between Lord Folken and his brother. Here we learn a little bit of Folken's backstory and his goals. It's revealed that Folken is actually Vaughn's brother, something that wasn't known until this point, and that he seemingly betrayed the kingdom of Finalia. Vaughn reveals that Folken was originally thought to be dead, having failed to kill a dragon. However, now he only views him with disgust, seeing him as a traitor who sold out the kingdom. For all of Vaughn's resentment, though, Folken does genuinely seem to love, or at least appreciate his brother, and instead makes an offer to Vaughn to join him so that they may pursue peace under Emperor Dornkirk. Again, this interaction is very important, and we will focus more on it later. I would also like to mention that as Vaughn is completing his escape from captivity, Folken does go out of his way to not only let him go, but also to toss back his hereditary sword. In fact, this act of kindness even helps save Vaughn, as said sword is what prevents Dillandau from striking him down in one clean hit. Anyways, after Vaughn's escape from captivity, Folken continues his duties as the strategos of Zweiback. That is the guy who figures out how to carry out the instructions given to him by Emperor Dornkirk. This generally sees him pursue Vaughn to various places, although he never actually tries to kill him. He instead tries to capture or persuade him to join his cause, as it does seem that he genuinely cares about his brother and he wants them to be on the same side. And Folken would also carry out the invasion of the Duchy of Freld. In this role, Folken sends out Dillandau to do the dirty work, and then accepts the duchy's surrender after the Battle of the Fortuna Temple, which secures the power spot for the Empire. After this, Folken continues the pursuit of his brother and his companions, and after Dillandau's unfortunate exit and mental breakdown, we soon see the entry of two new characters, Neria and Aria, who are the Leopard sisters and seem to be quite fond of Folken. They will go on to sort of be his deputies for a while during Dillandau's absence, and their deaths later in the series will actually catalyze his betrayal of Zweiback, and to an extent, his redemption. While the main cast does end up in Atlantis for a bit, Folken kind of just stands around watching things carry out. Anyways, after this, Emperor Dornkirk's focus turns to capturing Hitomi herself, which sees Folken and the Cat Assassins likewise do the same. It should also be noted, though, that Folken is also the guy behind the fate manipulation, which ended up almost setting up Hitomi with Alan. It was in fact his idea to do so, and one of his last true acts for the Empire. One of his last sins before coming clean about his failures and his deluded ideas. Although they do fail in capturing Hitomi, it's not for lack of trying. However, one of these failures actually sees Vaughn destroy the flying fortress which Folken inhabits. While Folken seems to go down with the ship, though, Dornkirk contacts him one last time, and it is in this conversation where Folken is finally fed up with Dornkirk's lack of empathy. As someone who's very empathetic himself, Folken has had enough and decides to sell out Dornkirk. This sees him contact Hitomi and his brother in the next episode, and even switch sides. In this critical interaction, Folken and Vaughn reunite on the burned out ruins of the kingdom that they were once set to inherit. In this meeting, Folken proves his integrity by saving both Vaughn and Hitomi from hungry dragons, and he admits that he is a criminal, and he admits that he has done great wrongs to many. However, he does admit that he did so in pursuit of a greater peace, and he also divulges his backstory. It turns out that Folken was kind of forced into his role, as a dragon bit off his arm and left him for dead. He was, however, rescued by Emperor Dornkirk, who gave him a new arm and sort of a mission in life. That mission, of course, was to follow Emperor Dornkirk to both pay back a debt that he felt he owed to him, and to continue the quest that both he and Dornkirk seemed to agree upon, that is, the pursuit of peace. However, while Folken is an empathetic man who was simply willing to pay the cost that Dornkirk thought were necessary, Dornkirk is a monster with no real sense of empathy, and didn't really see any human cost as something to really worry over. While Folken initially looked over this, as noted earlier, the constant carnage caused by Dornkirk's plans eventually pushed him up to the point of betrayal. And this leads us back to Finalia, where after divulging his backstory and saving Hitomi and Vaughn from hungry dragons, Folken joins up with the forces of Astorius and helps them, along with their allies, to fight Zybok in one final battle. While Folken isn't on the front lines during these battles, he does seem to remain in his study of sorts, and does seem to have figured out a way to teleport directly to Dornkirk if for some reason he feels he needs to strike him down. While he doesn't do this initially, he does so after Hitomi comes to him and says that she wants to end this herself. Although Folken is not initially invited, he takes the liberties of inviting himself, and does ultimately succeed in killing the Emperor. However, due to being in an area of increased action and reaction, he himself is struck down when his own blade breaks, and a shard of it ricochets into his heart. Folken quickly bleeds out, and passes on, having struck down the Emperor that both gave him purpose, and kind of ruined his life and the life of all those he loved. He does, however, go down knowing that he did his best to try and help Hitomi, and the brother that he truly loved. At the end of the day, Lord Folken is a great character because of the two pillars at the core of his character. These pillars are Folken's struggle to best enforce his moral sensibilities, his strong sense of empathy, how he seems to intrinsically value life, and how he serves as a sort of mirror and foil to his brother Vaughn, and their strong and complex relationship. Starting with the first column, while Vision of Escaflowne would have been fine with a generic cold villain, Folken is far above that. In fact, he's a rather compassionate man, it seems, struggling to balance the goal of bringing peace with Dornkirk's brutal methods. He is a man who is going along with the idea of the ends justifying means, but doesn't necessarily seem to agree with it. Like Dillandau, Folken's character is a very layered one. Although where Dillandau's character is partially focused on the mystery of his character, Folken is relatively open throughout the series, and a man committed to his ideals. These ideals, however, and Folken's own unfortunate life circumstances, though, give rise to a man who lives a contradiction-rich life. He strives to bring peace, and trumpets the intrinsic value of all life. However, he's a man that, in his quest to do so, is forced by his crazy boss to wield war as a tool. In fact, while Dillandau is usually the fist of Zybok, as the strategist in charge of him, or at least in theory, Folken is no less guilty for a lot of the crimes that he commits. While he does chide Dillandau every now and again for the excessive use of force, he never really disciplines him, or seems to intervene beyond that. Whether or not Folken initially cares about the harsh nature of Dillandau's actions and methods is also a good question to ask when we first meet these characters, and it does give us a good insight to Folken's character and initial thought processes. Before we get to know Folken, it's hard to believe that he's actually a somewhat moral man. In fact, he just seems to be a colder version of Dillandau. In this way, Folken seems just as bad as Dillandau, just in a different, more detached way. He seems a man without a heart. As the series progresses, though, we find out that this isn't true. He does have a heart. It's just that it's a heart that has grown cold and numb, and one which the circumstances around him and his title force him to actively repress, force him to ignore and act against. We see this as the story progresses and starts to reveal bits and pieces of Folken's backstory and humanizing traits. As a man who was forced to become an outcast by things really outside of his control, Folken is actually shown to be quite sympathetic to the downtrodden in many cases. We see this in the case of him rescuing Zongi, a loathed doppelganger, and the fact that he rescued the Leopard Sisters, again, people who were cast out by society and seen as trash simply for being who they were. Although Folken does seem to mirror Dornkirk a bit in his early appearances, he never loses his heart, and his acts display that he never loses his heart, where Dornkirk seems to have saved Folken for purely pragmatic reasons. Folken seems to have saved his followers out of a genuine sense of compassion. In fact, I don't even think he saved them to gain followers. It seems that he simply saved these people out of simple human decency and respect. He does care about their well-being, and it just happens that they were so enamored by this respect and compassion that they happened to join him after being saved. And this compassion is Folken's greatest strength, and what lends his character such an odd air to it. While it does ultimately redeem him, one does have to kind of ask where it was the whole time he's allowing Dillandau to, set cities on fire. This is kind of the center conflict of Folken's character, the conflict between his empathy and his desire to carry out the mission assigned to him. While Folken does initially value Dornkirk's mission, and he seems to do so out of a genuine sense of misplaced care, he's not the same character. Dornkirk is a cold and calculating man with basically no empathy, while Folken is a man with a lot of empathy who must repress it in order to carry out missions for the quote-unquote greater good. This means, though, that at his core, Folken is still inherently human, and avoids becoming a monster like Dornkirk. Yes, for a bit they do seem to live by ends justifying the means, but while Dornkirk does this out of an amoral and objective reasoning and doesn't seem to be bothered at all, Folken seems to do so out of a sense of gratitude towards the Emperor for saving his life, and out of a misguided sense that if the ends do justify the means, that this is still for the greater good, as he doesn't want anyone to suffer fates like his. This central conflict of empathy versus ends justifying the means shapes Folken's character greatly, and he always seems to be somewhat conflicted about this. He never seems happy while having to carry out the missions assigned to him, but does realize that there are practical points behind it, or at least that there seem to be initially. While he does repress his empathy, this cannot go on forever though, and eventually leads to his defection, as he decides to put himself and his morals above whatever perceived debt he might have to the Emperor. Having finally awakened from his stupor that the Emperor is good, or at least serving a greater good. He still seems capable of empathy, and this empathy and his strong desire to help others and protect defines his character both as a cold strategist for the Zybok Empire, and later as a defector who just tries his best to protect his brother. He is a moral person. It's just that his morality is twisted and exploited by Dornkirk, and to an extent Folken himself, in order to carry out very immoral missions. And I do say Folken himself because while Folken does possess empathy and want to help others, that doesn't change the fact that he willingly took part in a lot of these missions and deluded himself for a while in order to toe Dornkirk's line. He even admits this himself, as after his defection, he refers to himself as a criminal and a guilty man. In fact, he doesn't even try to deny this, and he owns up to all his mistakes, neither justifying or denying them. In a way, this is kind of the climax of Folken's character, as we see a well-intentioned, but very guilty man come clean about everything and finally be honest with himself and those around him. He's finally accepted the fact that while he's always intended to do good, he hasn't always carried out good. However, he also accepts the fact that he still intends to do good, and that he can try to make amends for whatever past actions that he's carried out. He may not succeed in fully making amends for everything he's done, but he will live knowing that he's at least trying to. This finally allows him to live more in accord with his own ideals, and to even do what he's always wanted to do, protect his brother. And Folken's relationship with his younger brother is the second pillar of his core character, and what defines him so well. In fact, in my opinion, this might be the richest relationship in the entire series, and it's a true feat of writing. It's a relationship between two brothers who very much loved each other initially, and were driven apart by things completely outside of their control. In a way, it's quite a tragic bond, as even though Folken still loves his brother, Vaughn kinda hates him for the rest of the series and only begrudgingly tolerates him. He does so because he thinks Folken sold out this kingdom. He does so because Folken is now working for his enemies. He does so because Folken seems to talk and act in a manner higher than his station. He comes off as a little arrogant when we don't necessarily understand the character as a whole, and we'll get to that. Folken never has anything rude to say to Vaughn, though. He does seem to be very understanding of his brother's point of view, in fact, and he does seem to understand that he does seem like a traitor in these circumstances. Instead, Folken tries to bring Vaughn around to his side because Dornkirk would probably just have him killed otherwise. Again, while this may seem kind of haughty and selfish at first, Folken really does just desire the best for his brother. It's just that in his earlier interactions with him, he doesn't know what the best is, as he's still deluding himself to follow Dornkirk. We see this initial conflict and Folken's keen understanding of his brother in the brothers' first interaction on screen. One of the most important and well-defined interactions in the entire series, in fact, for what it establishes and how it ultimately proves to ring true throughout the entire series, near the end of the series. In this early interaction, Folken calmly approaches Vaughn and tries to convince him that his mission is a good one, that he loves his brother, and that one day they will stand side by side in the name of peace. Vaughn, meanwhile, denounces Folken as a traitor and a man who's gone off the rails. He quickly denies all of Folken's points, and instead just sees the man who used to be his brother with nothing but pure contempt. Remember all of this for later on. Anyways, this initial interaction establishes a one-sided relationship, where Folken tries his misguided best to save his brother, and or reshape the world best for him, and Vaughn tries his best to stop his brother out of a not entirely correct sense of hatred and betrayal. Although Folken talks very clearly with his brother and is very open with him, their early communication is hampered by both his own delusion and Vaughn's unwillingness to give his brother a second moment of thought. What this creates is a dynamic where one brother tries to redeem himself, while the other denies that there are any chances to, and both of them can't really see eye to eye. In fact, even after Folken defects, Vaughn still seems to detest him, which Folken doesn't hold against him. This harkens back to Folken's empathy, as he never holds any ill will towards his brother and understands his feelings for the most part. This understanding seems to come from both Folken's own past and his desire to prevent something similar from happening to his younger brother. As someone who was forced into exile for failing a test he probably didn't even want to take, Folken understands what it's like to be screwed over by a system that he can't have any choice but to be a part of. Folken never failed because he's a fraud or because he's bad, but simply because he fails. This doesn't change the fact, though, that he's left for dead and rescued by a madman who kind of manipulates him into going along with his crazy schemes and taking over his life. This sees responsibility foisted upon Folken, all the while taking away all he ever knew. It is nothing but remarkable, in fact, that through all of this, he does retain most of his empathy, and probably even gains some through his trials. He has been through a lot and wants to prevent others from going through similar issues, especially his younger brother, all that he has left. When we think about this, Folken and Vaughn actually mirror each other quite a bit. Both are young men who lose everything through no fault of their own, only to find great responsibility foisted upon them in its place. Folken becomes Dornkirk's right-hand man, and Vaughn must stop him. As a result, both are now consumed by a quest to protect something or someone dear to them, even though they never initially sought out to. Folken wants to protect his brother, and Vaughn wants to protect Hitomi. Neither of them wanted this great burden, but now it's a core part of who they are and what they must do, and now they are destined to fight. They are not the same, however, and once Folken awakens from his own delusions and re-emphasizes his pacifistic nature and re-embraces his pacifistic ideals, he is able to both guide himself and his brother towards something of an understanding and carry out his true mission, to protect his brother. Although Folken's change of heart does finally bring about the fragile reconciliation of the two, though, it more importantly serves as a sort of ironic vindication of Folken's points from episode 4, from the important interaction mentioned earlier. In the end, Folken does seem to have a good mission, to bring peace, and he does carry it out of a loving desire to protect his brother, and that they do end up on the same side. It's just that it's not the side that Folken thought it was going to be. And I bring this up because it proves that Folken was kind of looking out for his brother the whole time, and that the whole time he did care. Ironically enough, by episode 22 or so, what initially seemed like a haughty list of arrogant commands and lies turns out to be a seemingly reasonable and heartfelt mission statement of compassion. The evolution of Folken's demands are a great microcosm of Folken himself, as what initially seems like a very cold, haughty, and unlikable man, in all actuality turns out to simply be a very troubled man, trying the best to protect his brother, all within the limited confines afforded to him. In this way, Folken is a very tragic character. Someone who didn't want to be the bad guy, but was kind of forced and manipulated into doing so because he believed it was the only way that he could kind of protect his brother. Someone whose morality was used against them, and someone who gave in to the notion that the ends justify the means, because at that point, the ends were all he had to cling to. Like Dillandau, though, Folken does go on to overcome his destiny, and even goes on and goes out on his own terms. His sacrifice is one out of love, and proves his dedication to his brother and to the greater good. It proves that Folken was redeemable, and it proves that he was never quite the monster he was initially made out to be. It proves that he did do something to overcome his tragic happenstances, and that he did take over his own life and his own destiny at the end of the day. It proves that Folken had a heart all along. And the topic of the heart leads us to talking about the man who follows his heart and his moral compass in spite of whatever material challenges might stand in the way of that. Now this character, of course, is Dryden. Dryden is another great character of the series for some reasons that he shares among the rest of the cast, like good writing and introspective scenes, and for a few reasons very specific to him. What makes Dryden stand out the most is his dismissal of fate and how much he believes in free will, free thought, and free choice. He is perhaps the embodiment of free will in the series, and serves as a realistic argument against the powers of fate and the ideas of fortune-telling and dowsing. He fills a place in the cast that was desperately needed up until this point, as the guy who gives voice to any sort of skepticism or questioning of the systems present that perhaps the viewers might have had. In this way, in fact, he's kind of a linchpin of the series, and important for more than simply what he does in it. But of course, let's start as we always do by asking, what does he do? Now, Dryden's plot summary is a relatively brief one, as he doesn't really enter the series until about the halfway point. He's mentioned earlier as Millerna's wandering betrothed, but that's about it, a few references here and there. His first on-screen appearance occurs after Vaughn suffers horrendous injuries due to his blood bond with Escaflowne and almost dies. While he's fading fast though, the Crusade runs into a merchant convoy that just so happens to be headed by Dryden. Dryden is then contacted by the main cast and proceeds to both summon for a repair team for Escaflowne and then pay for the repairs out of his own pocket. Afterwards, he has a conversation with a confused Millerna, admitting that he did this more to impress her, and that he does seem to love her. He understands, though, that she's hesitant to marry someone that she never has really got to know before this point. He also understands, though, that Alan Schezar's father tried to find Atlantis, and seeing as that might be important, he presses Alan for information about his father's journey. Alan and the rest of the cast then decide to kind of go along with Dryden's plans because A, Atlantis is kind of important to the greater schemes of Dornkirk and the plot in general, and B, the man kind of did just save Vaughn's life, and they do kind of owe him. This sees the group make their short trip to the Mystic Valley, where Hitomi, Alan, and Vaughn are eventually teleported to Zybok. The rest of the cast, however, are not, and it is Dryden who correctly assumes that it's better to return to Astorius, as if the main three are alive, that's where they would probably return to. Dryden is correct in this assumption, and he, Millerna, and the rest of the cast eventually regroup with the main three back in Palace. Here, Millerna and Dryden go through with their arranged marriage, although it is interrupted by the attack of Folken's cat assassins, while Hitomi is distraught over having lied about seeing a possible attack coming. Dryden quiets her fears by saying that he doesn't really believe in fortune-telling, and that even if she had told him, he probably would have gone through with the wedding anyways. This is an important interaction, as Dryden is among the first characters to straight up say, I don't know if all this card stuff is true, I think we should think for ourselves and take our own actions. I think Vaughn says something similarly in like episode 2 or 3, although by this point, everyone has kind of gone along with fortune telling, and Dryden's the first guy to straight up voice any possible audience concerns that maybe this isn't 100% correct all the time. Anyways, Dryden settles into his place as the new seeming ruler of Astorius, and helps put together the coalition to stand against Zybok. While he doesn't do much on the battlefield, he admits himself it isn't always about force. And he does help put together a great force, and seem to generally lead the kingdom through some difficult times. These difficult times include 98% of the war, and during this time he does make many difficult decisions in both his professional and personal life. Now, I said 98% of the war because one of the most important decisions he makes at this point is letting Millerna go as the war draws to a conclusion. He knows that she probably wouldn't have married him if she had a choice, and thus resolves to better himself to the point where she would willingly choose him. He does this to both stick to his ideals and to restore some agency to her. With this, he walks away from a great fortune and even a literal kingdom to once again become a merchant and live side by side with common folks, hoping to better himself until he, quote, makes Millerna fall for him. We last see him in the credit scenes heading out on this journey of self-improvement. Dryden, in spite of his very limited screen time, is a very important character for more than simply what he does in the plot though. In fact, his introduction near the end of the series is very appropriate, as his character serves as a self-aware rebuttal of many of the practices, beliefs, and characters of the series up until this point. He is important as the first, and initially only, character who will flat out question the validity of fortune-telling, and instead seems to champion free will above all. For this reason, he fills a very important role in the series, as the guy who gets the ball rolling on everyone creating their own fate, of everyone embracing their own agency, and of everyone saying that maybe destiny isn't really a 100% predetermined thing. Up until this point, everyone kind of just sees destiny as real and pretty much unchangeable. I mean, they do act on their own accord and they do take actions, but everyone takes the card readings at face value, and everyone tends to see fate as this great, unchangeable force. Everyone goes along with fortune telling, and no one really seems to fully embrace their own agency 100%. Millerna, of course, is the only possible exception to this, as she's trying to forge her own path. Compared to everyone else, though, Dryden is the opposite, and a breath of fresh air. Someone who can give voice to any skepticism the viewer might voice, and get to the point of making one's own fate. While the fate mechanics in Escaflowne are consistent enough not to cause any great questions or break the suspension of disbelief, the fact that they're not super questioned early on is an initial, if not weakness, then quirk of the series. Because let's be real, if this was taking place in the real world, or with real people, or at least someone who was relatively skeptical, at least someone would probably have the idea to go, hey, is this fortune-telling stuff real? Can we really follow dowsing? Is this magic legit? Someone who would at least question the mechanics of things present, as people tend to do. Every crowd has a skeptic, and Dryden fills the role of a well-intentioned skeptic very well. He dismisses fate for the most part, and instead always does things his way. Without Dryden, the theme of creating one's own future, and the show itself really, would be worse off, as the viewer could rightfully ask, why does everyone believe this stuff? Why don't they do their own thing? Was this all fate? Were they really acting on their own decisions? Or was it fated that they make decision? And so on and so forth. With Dryden, though, the show can smoothly and firmly start to transition into its deeper themes and prove that people do have agency. Dryden isn't just an important character for this logistical feat, though, as he's also a very well written and characterized man with good layering and development, like many characters in the series. When we first meet him, he seems kinda shady and weird. He doesn't necessarily seem malefic, but by no means does he seem to be a great man. This is partially established by Dryden himself, as he's pretty open and he admits that he helps the group simply to impress Millerna. By this point, Dryden seems more like a scallion that the group must use to get by. Again, not someone who's necessarily bad, but not an outstanding hero or great man either. As the series progresses though, Dryden slowly becomes more and more respectable, as we realize that his honesty with Millerna wasn't based out of some lack of respect or him being uncouth, but more in his ideals of honesty and free thought. While he is often motivated by personal desires, one of them does seem to be the greater good, and he is certainly honorable and makes sure to always live by his own code. And this code is one that emphasizes personal freedom and personal choice. As someone who works with a lot of money and merchandise, Dryden recognizes that those are not the be-all end-all in life, and instead places much more value on life itself, free thinking, and free expression. In fact, he seems to place almost no value on money itself. He's kind of an inversion of an archetypal merchant, in fact, as he always seems to value people over profit and sticks to his values near religiously. Again, these values are a deep cherishing of personal freedom of actions, beliefs, and thoughts. While this initially seems to set Dryden up as the kind to shirk responsibility, this isn't necessarily true either, though, as it seems he simply has a unique view of how to handle responsibility. He seems to genuinely care for others and take his role as a leader seriously. He does recognize the need to be responsible in critical situations, though he goes on to do so in a way which he finds satisfactory, and not necessarily the most conventional way. When the common good or person is in danger, and when others depend on him, Dryden will step up. It's just that he does it in his own way. He will have your back, but not necessarily how you expect him to. This is because, as a free thinker, he refuses to do something simply because it's conventional. He refuses to be bound to any system, as doing so could eventually lead him to following the system more than himself, and possibly compromising his ideals. This stubborn adhesion to his ideals is an extension of his free-thinking nature, and further distinguishes him as a character. Where many characters like Alan or Folken seem to mold their ideals to the reality on the ground, or whatever system or goal that they may be trying to achieve or be part of, Dryden for the most part seems to prefer attempting to mold the system to his ideals, or straight up leaving a system which may force him to compromise his ideals. While this often does result in him taking inefficient, unconventional, and even self-deprecating actions, it doesn't mean that he's irresponsible or bad. It just means that Dryden wants to do his things his way, and to him, his way is sticking to his ideals, and that he's so willing to do so that he doesn't mind going the extra mile or paying the extra penny needed to do so. We can see all of Dryden's character threads accumulate in his relationship with Millerna. In their first interactions, Dryden is quite open, and while attracted to Millerna, recognizes that she may not necessarily feel the same about him. He's even quite frank about this, telling her that A, he understands her hesitance, and that B, he doesn't believe himself to be a particularly outstanding man either. Millerna, for her part, is initially hesitant, but not too off-put by him, and even starts to warm up to him to an extent. She goes from, he makes me uncomfortable, to, he's not that bad. Upon returning to Astorius, though, the two do eventually get married, as Millerna feels like it's the best for the kingdom, and her sense of responsibility overrules her personal feelings. Although Dryden does turn out to be a competent ruler, and even sees the kingdom through most of the war. Around this point, Dryden knows that he's needed as a leader, and steps up. He doesn't necessarily want to do this, but he recognizes that people are depending on him, and he's not going to let them down. However, once the war nears its conclusion, while Dryden could have gone along with this arranged marriage thing and kind of ignored Millerna's input and gone through with things from there, he doesn't, as he still does take her seriously, and takes her opinion seriously, and is also shown to have never been quite comfortable with the idea of an arranged marriage anyways. This isn't because it infringes on his power of choice, but because it infringes on Millerna's. Again, he's not upset that he had to marry her, he's upset that she had to marry him. This isn't him looking down upon himself, but simply him sticking to his ideals. And as a man with a good deal of honesty within him, he doesn't want her to be unhappy for his sake, especially now that he isn't really needed by this point. Knowing that an arranged choice is no choice at all, and that this quote-unquote win isn't a fair one, he decides to nullify it. Dryden therefore rectifies this whole arranged marriage ordeal by walking away from it all, and allowing Millerna to make her own choice. His final act as her husband is therefore to simply let her go and make her own decisions, something that she's always wanted. Of course, he does leave the door open for himself, but he does recognize that if the choice is completely hers, he can't necessarily influence it further than, making a kind request. Dryden doesn't go through all this, not only so that she can be honest with him though, but that so he can also be honest with himself. He is so adamant about personal freedom, in fact, that he would rather release Millerna just so she can exercise her own freedom of choice, and that he can hopefully win her back in a fair way later. He doesn't want to compromise his ideals, and worse, hurt someone simply because it may benefit him on paper. As someone who understands the nuances of life, Dryden is perfectly willing to go through with this because he knows that sometimes it's better just to take an L than establish a life upon a lie, especially a lie that may be hurting others, and isn't necessarily worth hurting others over. He knows that life and individual agency are sacred, or at least to him, and he isn't going to be a hypocrite simply because it may theoretically benefit him this one time to compromise on his ideals. Once again, he takes the high road, even if it is a very out of the way and winding one, even if it is kind of to his own detriment, and all of this proves his strength of conviction and his own inner strength in general. He puts sticking to his ideals and being what he considers a good man above any perceived social system or goal that isn't absolutely necessary. In this way, Dryden is also unique as probably the biggest foil to the entire cast, where Alan and Vaughn and Dornkirk and Folken and Hitomi and Millerna are all people who are bound to a system or goal or set of responsibilities and tasks, and kind of just go along with things because they have to. Dryden is a responsible man outside of any system, perfectly willing to accept losses and walk away from things if he feels it's the proper decision to make. Where the rest of the cast may compromise on their ideals from time to time in the name of the quote-unquote greater good, Dryden almost never compromises on his ideals, and if he does, he's the most open about it. Again, this is because he's the only one who puts being honest with himself and others above the perceived greater good or social constructs present. And this is a real honesty that we don't see in a lot of the cast. Again, Folken may say he's doing the greater good by helping Dornkirk, who in turn says he's doing the greater good by creating fate for man, but they take a lot of really morally questionable actions. Even Vaughn and Alan, and Hitomi once or twice, make very questionable decisions and compromise their morals because it's for the quote greater good here and there. Dryden is, again, probably the only one who doesn't really do this, as he puts honesty above everything, and is willing to walk away from a system which may not prioritize honesty and freedom above all. This isn't to slander any of the rest of the cast, it's simply to say that Dryden is a great embodiment of a principled freethinker. At first he seems kind of weird and maybe even dumb because he goes out of the way to do things that aren't necessarily logical or don't necessarily make 100% sense. And he does seem kind of shady at first, so we ask, what's this guy's angle? What's he up to? That wasn't a logical decision. But as we get to know him and we get to see that his angle is simply to be honest with himself and simply to be honest with everyone else the whole time. More honest, in fact, than almost the rest of the entire cast. His only angle is simply trying to live according to his own ideals. And these ideals are what he treasures the most. And he treasures them so much that he's basically willing to walk away from everything just to remain faithful to himself and respect the dignity of those around him. He is willing to walk outside of any system just to maintain that honesty, just so that he can continue to know that he is being honest with himself, just to continue being an outsider that, while perhaps a bit odd, while perhaps going out of the way to do things his way, is still one that is truly strong and noble. Having just examined the character of Dryden, let's now look at the character of Millerna, one which is somewhat closely tied to him. When I started typing the script on her, my initial thoughts were not the most positive. Upon reflecting upon it though, I can say that of all the cast, Millerna probably grew the most and is quite a confident and respectable lady by the end of the series. She goes from someone I genuinely would not want to be in the same room with, to someone I can genuinely respect and say seems quite emotionally mature, someone that has learned to embrace their own agency and thinking processes in order to craft their own destiny. She evolves from a headstrong woman who thinks she knows what she wants into a confident woman willing to admit that sometimes she might not always know what she wants. But that's okay, because that's a problem that basically everyone has at some point, and along the way, she learns to think for herself. She's another great exercise in character writing that this series pulls off very well, as she does an excellent job in connecting to the main themes of the series, those themes being that sometimes what we want isn't always what it seems, and that one must make their own destiny. Living up to these themes so strongly, she also imparts them upon the viewers. Both her character growth and her actions display this, as Millerna learns not only about the outside world, but also about herself and the human condition. But of course, as we always do, what does she do in this world? Millerna is introduced early in the series as one of the princesses of Astorius, and Alan Schezar's biggest fan. In fact, upon the cast's arrival in Palace, she seems to fixate on the man, going so far as to literally beg him to sweep her off her feet and away from her arranged marriage. Well, Alan, of course, is a bit uncomfortable with this and tries to shut her down a little bit. He could try harder. He doesn't commit and fails, and Millerna continues to tag along with the cast for the duration of their stay in Palace. In those earlier times, she comes off as quite of a spoiled brat, and one which doesn't necessarily know how to talk or relate to people. She even beefs with Hitomi a little, seeing her as both possible competition and, if nothing else, a country bumpkin. When Van and Hitomi are forced to flee the kingdom, and Alan is arrested for having associated with them though, Millerna starts to think for herself, and starts to take her own actions. The first of this is freeing Alan from prison, and warning him that the Duchy of Feld is about to be invaded by Zybok forces. Alan then goes off to warn the Duke, and as a thanks, he literally shoves her home. Even though she's actively trying to do her own thing now and run away. This doesn't deter her though, and Millerna, and the Mole Man, later escape, successfully joining a merchant convoy. As fate may or may not have it, this convoy happens to run into a wounded Alan Schezar, and Millerna herself ends up saving him using her previous medical studies. She has studied medicine because she thought it was her own active way of helping the people of her kingdom instead of remaining as a figurehead, more or less. Having saved Alan, and with the mission to Freed overtaking the need to get Millerna home, Millerna joins the main cast, and while still clinging to Alan, actively tries to be kinder to Hitomi and the rest of the group as well. While staying in Freed, Millerna continues to nurse Alan and try and convince Prince Sheed of the group's innocence, and when said innocence is finally established, Millerna is allowed to stay in the villa of her deceased older sister, Marlene. Now, this was the previous wife of the current Duke, and here, Millerna discovers that her sister's journal is intact. She reads it and learns that Marlene and Alan were once intimate, and that the Prince of Freed is actually Alan's son. This revelation rocks Millerna's worldview, as her ideal prince is now proven to be not so ideal after all. Now, while Alan technically did nothing wrong, as he probably would have married Marlene if, that was an option available, at the end of the day, this is still a guy who's kind of leading her along, and, never said this. Come on, dude. You should have shut her down earlier. Anyways, Millerna confronts Alan about this before the big battle, but even as he is about to admit this, she literally refuses to hear him tell the truth and runs out. She then runs along with everyone else to the Fortuna Temple, and once that battle is lost, further afield. This eventually sees them run into Dryden's convoy. And while she is uncomfortable interacting with the man she is supposed to be married to, she does appreciate his honesty and slowly comes to understand and respect him. His open and informal personality foil Alan's almost perfectly, and soon she starts to question her worldview and the world itself, and maybe, perhaps, if she even is that attached to Alan. She even asks Hitomi for advice in this regard, proving that the two have come along quite a way. Still undecided, she, after a brief stay in Atlantis on the trip home, then decides that she will wed Dryden in a calculated move for the greater good, seeing it as a decision that is agreeable to her family and the royals, agreeable to higher society, a move which will generally benefit society as a whole, and one which she can tolerate as she does seem to respect the man and care for him, if not romantically then as a fellow human. Although this wedding is ruined by the attack of Folken's Cat-Assassins, Millerna does seem to care for Dryden by this point, again, if not romantically, then compassionately. She convinces herself that she's grown up, and that this sacrifice is the right call. During her marriage to Dryden, she proves to be rather dedicated to the people, and more open than ever, as she now seeks out Hitomi and others for even friendly conversations. Rather unexpectedly, though, Dryden annuls their marriage as the war draws to a close in order to restore her agency. With this new agency, and finally having learned the value of her own rationale, and what she really wants, that is to simply be her own person, Millerna doesn't call Alan back, and she doesn't tell him to marry her or anything like that. Instead, she respectfully, but professionally, sees him off to war, and by the end credits, it's implied, or at least to me implied, that she's now ruling Astoria as its new queen. In the beginning of the series, Millerna is immature, and not quite sure of who she is or what she wants. Again, that's okay though, because that's a problem a lot of people, even adults, have. In fact, this kind of sets up Millerna perfectly to explore this theme of not knowing what one may want with their life or what to do with their life. As the series progresses, she explores this theme more and becomes more and more of her own person, as she starts to associate with more people and grow more comfortable and familiar with herself, the world, and others. She's a great character not only for her growth, but also because of how said growth directly ties into these themes. Millerna's initial journey is generated from her decision to run away and make her own decisions. This is a great way of establishing her character, as it shows that she has desires that are kind of simple, i.e. pursuing her naive infatuation with Alan, but also kind of complex and deep, like the desire to think for herself. These two motivations do a good job of setting up her character as one who incorrectly thinks she knows what she wants in the specific, in this case Alan, and correctly knows what she wants in general, that is to simply be her own person. Establishing Millerna's goals and motivations in this manner show that she is intelligent and on the right track, but not quite in touch with herself to quite know what she wants to pursue exactly. Having little agency for most of her life, she actively craves it, which is pretty reasonable and makes a lot of sense. But she initially wants it in order to pursue an idealized fantasy marriage, which is an unrealistic goal and shows that she has quite a bit to learn. All of this lets us know that she is flawed, but not because she's a horrible or immoral person, but because she's simply one that is still learning about how things work, learning how to interact with others, and learning who she is and what she truly wants. As the series progresses, she soon starts to learn things and meet new people, and grow as a result. This growth is most illustrated in several critical interactions that feed into one another. The first of these major interactions is when she learns that Alan is actually Sheed's father, and that he isn't perfect. This doesn't shatter Millerna, although it does cause Alan to lose quite a bit of stock in her eyes, and it also shows us that she isn't quite mature by this point, as she literally refuses to hear Alan admit the truth, which he seemed like he was about to do. The next critical flashpoint is when she meets Dryden for the first time, and learns that not everyone or everything is how it seems. Although she is initially off-put by his frankness and peculiarities, and the fact that she's supposed to marry him, she soon respects his honesty and his self-confidence. By this point, Millerna is starting to truly think for herself and balance both her heart and her brain, as she soon starts to question the status quo and what she really wants. This allows her to grow in many other ways as well, as we can see her grow more friendly with all those around her when she asks Hitomi for advice. She doesn't ask for a reading or any service, but simply Hitomi's honest opinion as a woman and as a friend. This is a sign of great growth, as two initially acrimonious associates have now become honest and open friends. By this point, Millerna is much more mature and responsible. Her travels have opened her eyes to not only the wide range of choices available to her, but also the large responsibilities that lie upon her. As such, she kind of overcorrects and decides to marry Dryden for the quote-unquote greater good. However, this still shows a degree of growth, as while her pursuit of Alan was an ill-informed initiative based on a naive perception of the ideal knight, her marriage to Dryden is instead a calculated act in which she's fully aware of the decisions she's making and the sacrifices she is choosing to give up. In this case, she is deliberately sacrificing her freedom, while the quest for Alan was her quest. Her marriage to Dryden is for everyone, and she is fully aware of this. Dryden is too, though, and as a result, allows her to go her own way once the war winds down. This sees Millerna reach her final form, as she has learned not only what it is to be your own person, but the value of being one's own person and thinking for oneself. She now knows that what she wants to be is simply herself, and what she's wanted all along is simply her own agency. She confirms this in her final scene with Alan when she respectfully, but distantly and professionally, wishes him luck and tells him not to comfort her. She pushes him away not out of some sort of spite, but out of the realization that she must learn who she is on her own, and that she must learn how to take comfort in herself before she can really commit to something or someone else, as if she doesn't necessarily know who she is at her core, it kind of makes it difficult to fully commit to something or someone else. In this way, Millerna's kind of gone full circle. She started her quest in her pursuit of Alan, believing that he alone would make her happy. By the end of her quest, though, she's now learned that if she wants to be happy, she has to put in the effort herself. And later, once she truly knows who she is, then she can pursue healthy relationships. She wants to learn how to solve problems instead of simply asking someone to do it for her, so she can be a better and more in touch person in her later life. Millerna is a great character because she also shows the process of someone learning to temper expectations and hold reasonable expectations. Not everything or everyone in life is going to be super, and nothing of the world is perfect. Millerna is a young woman learning this, and in turn also imparting this to the viewer. In specific, she learns that Alan isn't perfect, but in general, she learns that nothing is really, and it's up to us to deal with these things in a healthy and productive manner. She comes to grips with this, and we soon start to see her accept, learn, and evolve. She thinks more and more for herself, and realizes that clinging to naive idealizations of the perfect anything will only lead you astray. And this is a great and important lesson for anyone to learn, and another one of the reasons Millerna is important to the show as a whole, as she ties in very strongly to one of VOE's greatest achievements as a show, which is kind of deconstructing and disproving a lot of the fantasy tropes which one might expect for it. Millerna herself shows the need to discard naive idealizations and instead accept the fact that everyone has some sort of flaw. That's not to be a downer or say that life sucks, it's simply to state a fact that we all must work with. By accepting this though, Millerna can adopt a more honest outlook and therefore make better decisions for herself, as she can now base her decisions on facts and her own personal codes of conviction and moral and honor instead of just naive fantasies. She learns how to think, and this is a great example of how VOE subverts and disproves fantasy fate tropes one might expect from a series like this, as instead of simply ending up with the shiny knight and again being kind of reduced to a character with a lot less agency, Millerna instead learns that fantasy isn't all it's cracked up to be, and that she must think for herself. She must be her own person if she wants to engage in any kind of healthy relationship with others. While her initial decision to run after Alan was her quote-unquote finally acting and thinking for herself, in actuality, she starts to achieve this only once she learns that Alan isn't perfect and that she has to accept the imperfect nature of the world and move on in her own way. that she, to some extent at least, must make her own destiny. And this is why I take no issue with Millerna ending the series as single, as I honestly think it would be tasteless to kind of have her run back to Alan. Instead, her being single is pulled off tastefully as it firmly establishes her as the controller of her own fate. One of the key themes of the series, and it inverts certain viewer expectations. So often it's common that the princess will just marry the knight or prince or whatever, and that's that, and she's kind of reduced to just being the wife of the princess or the knight or the king or whatever. Again though, that isn't necessarily how the real world works. Everyone needs to be their own person, and this is true in almost any regard of life. Even in relationships, where one party might be committed to the other, that party probably sought you out because you are you. Therefore, even in this context, it's still important to know who you are and to be you. So often, idealized and naive infatuations are just that. And establishing Millerna as a character that learns this and the importance of being oneself in order to pursue healthy relationships is a great service to the viewer and the themes of the show in general. Her being single goes a great distance to prove this point, and prove her own growth. In fact, it'd be super hypocritical if, for a series all about making one's own destiny and deciding who you want to be, if the princess would go through all this and then just kind of throw it all away to be like, it's, my knight in shining armor. Doing this would throw away almost all of her growth and surrender some of the agency she just worked so hard to recover. Again, while Escaflowne takes place in a fantasy setting, it does a great service to the viewer by including realistic characters, developments, and relationships like this to buck unrealistic ideas and fantasies. In this way, VOE is an excellent deconstruction of many fantasy tropes, and this proves Millerna's importance in it as not just a character with great development and writing, but one that imparts true wisdom upon us. She isn't just some token princess that makes a few rebellious moves and ends up with the prince anyways. Instead, she's a confident and intelligent woman who has, on her quest to take back agency, learned how to properly use it and learn what she truly wants. She's gained it back and is now mature enough to ponder how to use it, and come to the conclusion that what she really wants above all is to simply be herself, whether or not she's in a relationship. Again, she might pursue one later, however, it would be a better and different kind of relationship, as now she is in touch with who she is, as both a princess and a person. Having just finished looking at the secondary cast, it's time we now start to look at the big three, that of Alan, Hitomi, and Vaughn. Now, seeing that Vaughn and Hitomi are essentially the main characters of the series, we will start with Alan. Now, characters like Alan are the reason I examine supporting cast first, as it gives me additional time and additional angles and context with which to look at the main cast. And I'm glad I do in cases like this, because Alan's character is just such a layered one, and the extra time has really given me time to look at all these different layers. Now, when I first watched the series, Alan struck me as generic knight guy, someone cast in the trope of a knight in shining armor, that's about it. However, as the series progressed though, and as I rewatched more of it to make other videos, his character is explored more and more, and his layers became more apparent to me. Alan really starts to serve as a deconstruction of fantasy, in fact. I would say that's his main service to the show, in fact, that he provides a living deconstruction of many of the fantasy traits and tropes present in Escaflowne, and reinforces the show's themes of needing to make one's own fate and destiny using one's own agency. How he does this is simple in principle and nuanced in execution. In fact, Alan's character is such a layered and complex one that this is actually the second script I've had to type on the man, unsatisfied with my original and rambly 35-minute piece. This will hopefully be a more coherent and concise work, getting to the same points. I will take snippets from the original though, so please excuse some audio inconsistencies. One of these snippets will be the plot summary. We have a lot to get to, so instead of doing the usual plot paragraph essay component, I'm just going to name some bullet points of what this guy does in chronological order that I found, quote, most important. I'm sure I'm going to miss some things, but I'd like to think I covered all the important moments in this guy's story. Alan's place in the plot, if we boil it down to its simple bullet points, he appears in episode 3 when he rescues Vaughn and Hitomi from the swamp. He initially doesn't believe them about the attack on Finalia, although he has heard that Finalia is burning. He does end up teaming up with them though when Zybok forces attack his castle, which I guess is just on the outskirts of Astorius. This sees Vaughn captured, whom Alan does assist rescuing. Alan then goes to the king in a palace to plead on behalf of Vaughn. This doesn't really go anywhere, and instead Alan is just kind of set upon, I guess, by Millerna. He tries to shut her down with 2 or 3 lines, but that doesn't really go anywhere, and he kind of folds like a lawn chair. After that, he gets arrested for having associated with Vaughn having fled by this point. He gets rescued by Millerna so that he can help warn the Duchy of Feld that Zybok is going to attack him, but he just kind of shoves her away and goes on his own. He then gets stabbed, but luckily for him, Millerna ran away anyways and ends up saving him. This sees a wounded Alan now in the Duchy of Freyed, where he pleads with Prince Sheed and eventually convinces Sheed to give them a chance and help prove their innocence. Although this does lead to an awkward scene later where Millerna basically deduces that Alan is actually Sheed's father, to which Alan basically goes, "You figured me out. I slept with your dead sister." Anyways, he then takes part in the losing battles of both of Godashim and the Fortuna Temple. He watches the Duke of Freed die. Kind of just has a bad time, really. I want to pause right here for a second to say that this is kind of like the middle of the series, and from here, Alan's character really starts to, like, you start to see a lot more layers come out, and it's all kind of, I don't want to say downhill from here, but it gets a lot messier. Anyways, at this point, they run into the convoy with Dryden. Dryden saves Vaughn's life, although in return he does ask for the group to kind of help him find Atlantis. To do this, Dryden requests the logbook that Alan's father had given to him. Alan begrudgingly goes along with this because he does value the fact that Vaughn is alive, although he does say some like backhand comment to Dryden, and for this Millerna basically tells him to shut up. This moment right here, at least to me, was kind of like the death of the character, and you'll see why. This is kind of like a turning point, which I'll elaborate on later. Anyways, he goes along with the group to Atlantis. Here, he meets his deadbeat dad. We learn from his backstory that Alan's childhood was actually kind of traumatic. His deadbeat dad bailed, and then his sister was abducted, and then his mother died of basically loneliness and heartbreak by this point, leaving a young Alan basically all by himself with no real guidance in the world. And this backstory does kind of do a good job of setting someone up who's kind of not quite comfortable with himself or interacting with others because he's just experienced a lot of loss so far. That doesn't justify some of his later actions, but I do understand what they're trying to do here. Anyways, he then gets sent to Zybok, and he reunites with everyone in Palace when he and Hitomi and Vaughn escape from Zybok. He accepts, quote-unquote, that Millerna's getting married. He kind of seems like, about it, but doesn't really oppose it. And then there's a big storm, and this is where the Hitomi incident takes place. Now, I don't know how most of the fandom feels about this, but as someone who just came, sight unseen, watched the show, this, for me, was a very uncomfortable moment because, okay, so in context, behind the strings, Folken and Dornkirk are like, we need to interrupt Hitomi and Vaughn's relationship. How are we going to do that? We're going to set Hitomi up with someone else. Okay, that part makes logical sense. How are we going to do this? We are going to literally manipulate fate to make Hitomi fall in love with someone else. Okay, that makes no sense in real life, but in the context of the series, the lore and laws of the world established, that does make sense. That's okay. The weird part is that they choose Alan, and that doesn't necessarily seem weird on the surface until we look at ages. And I commented on this in the original plot overview where I said, it is kind of weird that Hitomi is like 6 years younger than Alan, and one of them is an adult legally speaking, and the other one isn't. Again, I get it, this is supposed to be like the 13, 14, 1500s where that kind of thing happened, and I also get it in that this is supposed to be like a deconstruction of a teenage fantasy. I understand that. But looking on it just at a surface level, this does not look good, and it does make me a little uncomfortable. Again, I get it, this is supposed to be a deconstruction of a teenager's fantasy, but literally doing that though, it just looks weird for reasons that I think are pretty obvious. It did make me a little uncomfortable. And past this point, Alan starts to manifest some behaviors which would make it uncomfortable even if they were both over 18, and we'll get more to that later. Anyways, after the Hitomi incident where he's quote-unquote manipulated to going along with this, he just kind of becomes a weirdo. We'll get some more on that later. He does fight in a few more battles. Hitomi leaves for a little bit, and while she's gone, Alan's long-lost sister Selena reappears, only for him to find out that it's Dillandau. Oddly enough, though, this seems to be the one thing which she seems to take relatively well. And then once Hitomi comes back, something clicks, I guess, for him, and he realizes, you know what? I need to back off. I need to let her do her thing. I need time to figure myself out. And he basically says, you know what, Hitomi? You're free to go pursue Vaughn. Do whatever you'd like. You're your own person. He does take part in the final battle, which sees him save Dillandau turns Selena. He saves her and then tells Vaughn basically, hey, Hitomi's waiting for you in Zybok. You should go tend to that. And then cut to credits. Yes, next scene he's in is in the credits, where he's with Selena looking over the grave of their mother, I assume. It seems like they've reconciled and that he has someone to talk to again. He suffered for lack of a family, it seems. And I hope he's doing better, because this guy has a lot of layers, and to be quite honest, I don't want to sound rude when I say this, but to be like 100% honest, he seems like someone that could benefit from therapy and someone to talk to. With Alan's place in the plot explained, watching Alan's evolution throughout the series is one of the most fascinating and, dare I say, even uncomfortable aspects of it. This is because of several important aspects of the character that we will explore in the following order. We will start by establishing the 3 different Alans. We will then transition into why Alan has these 3 different forms. Then we will look at how these forms impact the tone of the character. And finally, we will see how this accumulates to portray Alan as both a deconstruction of fantasy tropes and as, dare I say, the don't be like this character of Escaflowne. Before we establish who Alan's character impacts though, and how it impacts the tone and themes of the series, we need to first establish what this character is. This is kind of difficult with Alan though, because he tends to be inward and quiet. His personal feelings and his personal ideals are not really expressed very loudly, at least not by him, or at least not by his words. He isn't always honest with himself and or others, and this leads him to manifesting several different forms and ways of carrying himself. Now, these are not different personalities, they're just simply different parts of his personality coming through in different ways. The first of these forms is what we will call Knight Alan. Knight Alan is the guy we see on the box, the refined and calm knight who carries himself proudly and dignantly and always tries to help those in need. This is who Alan wants to be. We see this Alan when he fights to protect the town, or when he gives Vaughn advice about swordplay or something. This is a mature facade of sorts, which represents what Alan strives to be while denying any sort of emotional insecurity or issues which he currently faces. Should issues in Alan's personal and emotional life arise though, this polished exterior starts to chip away, and soon gives rise to what we will call professional Alan. This is the guy who, while still doing what it says on the box, isn't quite enthused about it. This is a guy who gets kind of snarky from time to time and goes along with things at this point because it's kind of his job and he feels obligated to. We see this Alan start to pop up after the trip to Freld, and especially in his early interactions with Dryden. This version of the character is one on the defensive, as a man looking to both manifest some grievances, yet still remain in the objective lines of who he wants to be, i.e. he still does the right thing, and he doesn't necessarily manifest any negative behaviors yet, but his mood has already been negatively impacted. Now, these grievances seem to manifest from a personal sense of loss, and the fact that he seems to loathe his perceived lack of agency. We will address this in the next segment. Professional Alan does serve as a bridge of sorts, though, between Knight Alan and the final form of Uncomfortable Alan. The bridge between the two is finally crossed in one of the first scenes that Alan shares with Millerna and Dryden, where Dryden basically asks for Alan's help going to Atlantis. Alan gets snarky with him, and Millerna basically tells him to shut up. Now, this is a very critical scene in Alan's character development, as not only does it start to delineate our full trip into Alan's psyche, but it kind of serves as the death of the character. Before this point, Professional Alan was just kind of snarky, but he was still Alan. This moment right here, and all of its very palatable uncomfortableness and awkwardness, though, shows that Alan is actually quite flawed, or at least very human at his core, and this begins our transition into Uncomfortable Alan. Now, Uncomfortable Alan is the final Alan we see, and while I don't want to say that it's his, quote, true form, it's the one which most openly manifests his own emotional inner turmoil. We see this Alan the most in later interactions with Hitomi, and a few other scenes. I deem this form Uncomfortable Alan because it seems that he's both uncomfortable with himself and interacting with others, and this leads to him exhibiting behaviors which may make others even more uncomfortable, such as being overprotective and, dare I say, controlling. We see this most in his relationship with Hitomi, which, quick note, again, the ages between the two do make me uncomfortable, seeing as that one is on one side of 18 and the other is not. Obviously that's bad, but I don't think that was a thing the writers consciously thought about. I think that's just an oopsie in the writer's room. No one dared to say, hey, I know this is a literal deconstruction of a teenager fantasy, but maybe we should cast someone who's not still a teenager, you know? I think that's more of an oopsie in the logistical end of things. I think what happened was a lot different than what was meant to happen, or that the writers didn't necessarily take the implications of the ages into full consideration. However, I want to point out, though, that this form of Alan is uncomfortable regardless of the age, and his relationship with Hitomi would still be awkward and uncomfortable even if they were the same age, because of the behaviors that he manifests. He seems emotionally stunted, and his interactions with Hitomi prove this, as he seems overprotective or doubtful and even a little controlling. Even without taking their uncomfortable age gap into consideration, it still would be awkward and kind of uncomfortable watching this carry out, even if they were both, say, 20. These negative behaviors, of course, stem from Alan's personal trauma and his inability to properly open up and discuss his personal traumas and tackle his own demons. Now, these traumas are the source of Alan's stunted emotional growth and are linked mostly to his childhood. Alan had a pretty unpleasant childhood, owing mostly to the fact that his father, a character I actively hate and had a 5-minute rant recorded about, which I can post if you'd like, walked out for quote-unquote reasons. He says it's to make fate, but again, I hate this character, and the way they write him is not particularly graceful or agreeable. And this left Alan to care for his younger sister Selena, who gets kidnapped, and his mother, who essentially dies of despair, alone. Having lost everyone from no fault of his own, Alan of course is traumatized, and this installs into him a burning loneliness and a fear of loss. These two often get into each other's way though, as ending loneliness requires company, which creates something to lose and therefore intensifies the fear of loss. Since solving one inflates the other, Alan is essentially stuck in a sort of negative loop. This isn't helped either by his early attempts to fix it by bonding with Marlene. While Alan's relationship with Marlene isn't explored in any real detail, it's obvious that the two did seem to have quite a strong relationship with each other, and it's obvious that its fractured ending did leave a negative mark on him. The loss of this major pillar of support for him seems to have made him much more withdrawn, and this further reinforces Alan's tendency to bottle up his emotions and emotionally isolate himself, lying to himself and others about how he truly feels. All of this creates a character whose tone is kind of all over the place as the series progresses. Early Alan, Night Alan that is, appears in a lot of episodes very consistently before the trip to Frayed, and it's a relatively straightforward performance of, Night Alan. Past this point though, he increasingly starts to share the screen with both professional and uncomfortable Alan, leading to an odd mishmash of presence and actions and tone depending on the circumstances of the scene. If it's a big fight and Alan needs to be Night Alan, he will fight the good fight. But as soon as we go back to a quieter scene, or he has to interact with Hitomi or something, it starts to get real weird real fast. Escaflowne's writing does a good job of exploring Alan's character's layers though, without directly going into character assassination. I will let you decide if that point was reached at all. His portrayal does grow less consistent as the series progresses, however, it is consistent in that it explores facets which are established early on, i.e., Escaflowne's writing does a good job establishing a character which is consistent enough within its own boundaries to believe that all the Allans are different forms of the same guy. And this is important because it allows Alan to serve as the ultimate fantasy trope deconstruction. As said in several videos by this point, even though Escaflowne is a fantasy piece, one of its greatest strengths is how it successfully deconstructs and disproves many tropes inherent of the genre. Alan is probably the best example of this, as while Night Alan establishes early on that, hey, there are knights in shining armor here, his evolution throughout the series disproves the naive idea that makes him like the perfect guy. He proves that there is no fantasy perfect knight, and that really there's no perfect fantasy everyone, that even if they can stick to outside codes of honor, everyone is still flawed in some way. He proves that someone can be, quote, honorable or chivalrous, and still not necessarily perfect, or pleasant, or mature and honest. He is a literal knight in shining armor, and yet still very flawed, and at times even unlikable, even if he does try to stick to chivalry most of the time. His presence serves as a sort of wake-up call not only for Millerna, but also one for the audience to the naive foibles present in the genre. Alan also serves as a wake-up call in the sense that I think he is the don't be like this character of the series. Now, this kind of character is relatively self-explanatory, a character defined by some sort of flaw which they manifest and in turn say to the viewers, careful, don't be like this guy. Alan's very unique in this regard though, as he's a protagonist in a role which is usually reserved for, if not antagonists, then some kind of supporting character. Examples we've covered on this channel include Alan Gabriel, the flaw of narcissistic nihilism, Daedalus Yameno, the flaw of just big nihilism, Tony Frost, the flaw of big narcissism, and Ukio, the flaw of apathy and, I'm gonna say it, probably psychopathy. Alan's writing is more subtle and nuanced in these examples though, as again, the point of his character is to sort of serve as a layered and deconstruction of the knight in shining armor. He proves that the writers did know what they were doing, and were saying that, hey, even a knight can manifest these flaws, so be careful that you don't. But what are these flaws in question? These are the central flaws of Alan's character, and the show tells us to avoid them, and these flaws are emotional dishonesty and repression, combined with a bit of failure to exercise one's own agency. I think it's obvious by this point that at Alan's core, there is a big knot of emotional baggage that he simply tries to ignore or kind of just tune out, and that it unduly affects both his judgment and his behavior. He isn't flawed because he's hurt. He isn't flawed because he's experienced pain. Those are human things, and no one can hold those against someone. He's flawed because he actively tries not to talk about them, because he actively tries not to work on them, and at times he even ignores offers of others to help him through them. The show is saying, hey, don't be like this guy. Talk about your feelings and make yourself who you want to be. And this ties in with Alan's second great flaw, which is that he seemingly uses very little of his, what I imagine to be great agency, to fix his personal life. In fact, it seems he makes very few decisions for himself at all. Now, obviously Alan doesn't decide to get traumatized as a child, and I don't blame him for accepting Balgus's offer to become a knight. Pretty reasonable. However, once he becomes a knight, Alan doesn't really do that much as far as we know. I mean, let's be honest, as an elite knight Kaylee, he's obviously got a lot of responsibilities, but I imagine he also gets a good amount of pay and some kind of renown. He seems relatively charismatic, and he's definitely a skilled knight. So, I mean, while these traits don't define a person, they could definitely be used by Alan to do his own thing and discover himself. There's a lot of options open to him. The world could be his oyster. He could really make a fresh start, in fact. But instead, all he really does is date his boss's daughter, something that he knows he shouldn't do, and that definitely crosses a professional boundary, and then becomes sad when this relationship doesn't work for dynastic reasons. Now, it is tragic that their love ends that way. I'm not going to deny that. But seeing as that he knowingly crossed a professional line and simply won't move on, that is something of note. I mean, it's been like 5 years, and she's literally dead. I know that sounds very harsh, but at this point, he needs to move on, and fixating on the past is just, it's not healthy. It's time to at least start moving on, baby steps at least. Again, Alan's central flaw is not that he has trauma, but that he actively represses it and tries not to move on, and this leads him to not using his agency. Since he hasn't completely moved on from Marlene, even though it's been like 3 years, he allows Millerna to just kind of enter into his life to act as a sort of weird substitute for her dead sister. This is something which reasonably he should not be doing because A, there's another uncomfortable age gap here. I know I should have said something about that in the Dryden episode, but they were both engaged to each other as minors, which was a thing nobility did. So while that is still kind of weird and uncomfortable, in a historical context it kind of makes sense for Dryden. In this case though, it's just kind of weird because Alan is, I guess, accepting the advances of the younger sister of his dead lover because he never quite got over her, and B, because she's already engaged. And I know he has a throwaway line where he's like, I don't know if we should do this, but he doesn't really, shut her down. He doesn't really stop her. He doesn't take action, is what I'm saying. He kind of lets others make decisions for him, and then gets upset when decisions he sleepwalk into don't necessarily pan out very well. And if the central theme of Escaflowne is making one's own fate and using one's own agency to do so, it has to be noted that Alan fails at both, and he kind of just goes through the motions of things and then laments when his fate isn't as he had hoped. He's just complacent sometimes, and I feel that's why he's a warning to us, why he is the don't be like this character of Escaflowne. Because at the end of the day, while he had great potential, while he is an elite knight, and he is in shining armor, he isn't a perfect man.
Hello. Previously
on the Vision of Escaflowne Retrospective. Alan had a pretty unpleasant childhood, owing mostly to the fact that his father, a character I actively hate and had a 5-minute rant recorded about, which I can post if you'd like, mentioned in the Alan video that there was a rant about his father prepared that I cut out because it was part of the 35-minute script, which honestly I didn't feel like editing. I'm glad I went with the condensed version, as I said basically the same thing. However, in order to condense it down to 22 minutes, I did have to cut out my rant on how I feel about Leon, i.e. Alan's dad. It is going to be in here. That is the point of this video, since some people thought it might be interesting to hear my thoughts on the character. However, instead of this just being a little meme rant, which it will be after this prelude, I wanted to say that my main problem with the character is not the idea of a deadbeat dad, or the idea of a guy just being a failure to his family. Unfortunately, that does happen. The reason I don't like Leon is because they treat this guy like he's a saint, even though he's kind of thrown away his entire life to simp for a woman who he met like for a combined 20 minutes, and seemed kind of uncomfortable being around him. I mean, note, the woman he's chasing, Hitomi's grandmother, never actually says anything in the scenes she shares with him. She kind of just looks uncomfortably at this guy who's traveling all this way to find her. Anyways, that's why I don't like Leon. Not because of the concept, but because of the way he's handled. They handle this guy who ran out on his family like some kind of great hero, even though he's not. He's just kind of a loser in my eyes, and a selfish one at that. Anyways, with the constructive part of this video out of the way, let's get to why we all came here. Quick tangent on Alan's father. I think I hate this character more than any other character I've seen in any of the series I've reviewed on this channel. There are a few characters that I've hated, or I don't know, hate's a strong word, I've disliked. Daedalus from Ergo Proxy is a good example. I did not like his character. For the most part, I didn't care for them because it seemed like the writers didn't quite know what they were doing, or because they were intentionally written to be dislikable. Daedalus is a great example of this. While I don't like his character, it's pretty obvious that you're not supposed to, because Daedalus is kind of like the, hey, don't be like this character. I get it. He's not supposed to be likable. And it's written very obviously. The show is saying, don't be like this guy. This guy sucks. So I have no idea why VOE decided to portray Alan's father the way he did. His dad just runs off so he could, quote, be his own man, or some flimsy BS about making fate or whatever. And again, I just hate how the show portrays this, because yes, I understand that making your own destiny is a key theme of the series, of yes, you gotta use your agency to make yourself who you want to be. I get it, that's a key theme of the series. However, we're supposed to feel bad for this guy because he died alone, because he decided to abandon his loving wife, because it's how he rebelled against fate or something? Like this guy is still unlikable and self-absorbed to me. Like, I don't understand how I'm supposed to feel about this character. I mean, it's obvious that, you know, I would think most people don't like Leon because he's kind of, well, you know, he just ran out on his family and kind of screwed everyone over. Again, but it seems like the show wants us to forgive this man and feel bad for him, but I don't feel bad for this guy. Like, what has he done? What has he done that I should feel bad for him for? He's abandoned his family. Why did he do that? He did that because he needed to go make his fate and talk to some woman who doesn't even talk back and seems vaguely uncomfortable in his presence. Great job, Leon. You destroyed your family for that. Okay, this guy's no Hohenheim. He's not going out to save the kingdom. He's not even going out to get Arby's or something. He's just bailing to bail, I guess. He says it's to make his fate. Oh, I gotta prove my destiny. But, you know, I don't know why that requires screwing over everyone else in your life. You could make the argument that, hey, this is his passion. Whatever. If that's the case, why don't you talk to your wife about it? Because if she loves you, and apparently you guys love each other, allegedly, I'm pretty sure she would be supportive enough of this to either go with you or to not be horribly traumatized if you just said, hey, I gotta do this thing. Yeah, no, bailing unexpectedly with no contingency or support plan left over for when you do that is the best possible option. Good job, Leon. Again, they set up this character, all of his actions set him up to be, like, despised, or at the very least, like, ah, man, what a douche. But for some reason, the show is like, man, this guy had a tragic life. This guy's, he sacrificed so much. He's doing all he can, but he he's not. He's doing all he can to screw over his family. Like, again, with every character in the series, Escaflowne does a good job of saying, here's the facts, here's what this character does, here's how they behave, here's a few of their opinions on things, you decide if you like that character or not. Every character kind of follows this pattern. Alan is a deconstruction of fantasy, yeah, but you can tell that that's kind of the point. However, the show never says if he's a good or bad person. Vaughn is kind of impulsive and learning to be a good king, but whether or not he is by the end of the series is left for you to decide. The show is pretty generous with allowing you to come to your own decisions about how you feel about certain characters. You may still hate Folken because he did work for Dornkirk, or you may say, you know what, he kind of got screwed over. I feel bad for this guy, you know. Or maybe the exact opposite. Maybe you hate Alan because he does exhibit some weird personality traits. And again, the show's pretty good about just letting the characters be themselves and saying, you decide how you want to feel about it. Every character except Leon, like this guy. It's pretty, I think it's pretty obvious that I don't like him. And I would assume that a lot of people don't either, because again, running out on your family to go simp for a woman whose name you don't even know is, I would think, not generally considered respectful behavior. So it seems like the show is setting up this character to be hated, or at the very least, like, not liked, serve as some kind of warning, like, hey, don't be like this guy. But again, I don't know what they want us to think in this case, because when Leon has his talk with Alan, Alan forgives him out of, like genuinely forgives him and feels bad for him, and I guess we're supposed to too. Like, it's one thing if Alan's like, hey man, you know, I gotta forgive you, I can move on with my life, close that chapter of the book. I would understand that. I don't understand, like, legitimately feeling bad for him, though, because he kind of did this to himself, and in the process of doing so, screwed over everyone else, vaguely, tangentially related to him. Like, if I was in Alan's situation, I would say, you know what, I'm not talking to you, whatever, we're done. I can move on with my life. I feel like that's what a well-adjusted person would make in this scenario. I'm not a doctor, other than, like, complete reconciliation, which, I mean, you can't because he's literally a ghost by this point, but that's besides the point. The point is, Escaflowne seems like it wants us to feel bad for this guy, and I really can't, because he really kind of just made a bunch of decisions that made no sense and were all very obviously net negatives, and I can't support that kind of reckless behavior, dude. Like, if you were solo and whatever, I guess, yeah, go do your thing, but the fact that you left your wife without any form of support, without even telling her that you were going to do this great quest, like, I don't believe you when you say you love her, because if you loved her, you wouldn't do that kind of thing. Yeah, so I don't like this character because his actions portray him as a scumbag, and the reason he confuses me so much is because Escaflowne says he's not a scumbag, or it seems like it wants to say that. Again, there's nothing wrong with a show having scummy characters, if the whole point is either don't be like this guy, or to establish them as scumbags so that we don't like them. That's fine, but Escaflowne establishes this guy as kind of scummy or weird or dumb or whatever. Then it says, let's forgive this man. He is a good man. I can't believe he's a good man in this scenario. That's the problem. I can't believe that. And it's very uncharacteristic for the show to tell the viewer how to feel about a character, because I don't think it does it with literally any other character except Leon. And maybe I didn't watch the scenes correctly. I've seen them, like, again, like 7 times. Or maybe I'm having a brain fart, but I don't know why we're supposed to feel bad for this guy. And it's one of the few tonal and writing decisions about this series that just baffles me to no end. You make an unlikable character, and then you handle him like we're supposed to like him or feel bad for him. It just makes me confused and dislike him more. Like, what was the point of this? For some reason, Alan's dad is cast as sort of like Space Jesus? I'm so sorry, Lord. But, you know, like, the tale of Alan's family is tragic, yes. But only because this asshat ran off. Like, he's not tragic, he's not smart, he's just a... Yeah, like he says some BS about, like, oh, I only married out of duty or whatever, but that's it, dude. Like you committed, and this woman loves you, and you allegedly love her. You bitch about how you miss her, even though you are the one that decided to go on this dumbass quest, literally for no other reason than to see some other woman. Like, you, man. And welcome back to the Vision of Escaflowne retrospective. With Alan examined, it's time we get to the next of the big 3 characters in this series, and that is Van, or Vaughn, depending on whether you prefer the subbed or dubbed version of Escaflowne. I will use the names interchangeably. Now, while Vaughn is not as layered as Alan, he certainly isn't bad. In fact, after the Alan video, I find Vaughn's rather straightforward and honest nature to be quite refreshing. In fact, of the big three, Vaughn is probably the simplest, but that is quite in line with his blunt and action-minded mindset, and it's not a criticism of the character. That's not to say he doesn't grow either, as Vaughn's character arc is a subtle but appreciated one, as he learns to balance his impulsive side with a rationale born of the desire to do the greater good. He is a young man that, while a tad impulsive, is still rather mature for his age, although does suffer the pitfalls of having to be forced to grow up too quickly. His growth continues throughout the series though, and his relationships with Hitomi and even his brother display a young man coming into his own, and one who learns the importance of not only taking care of others, but of taking care of himself. For all of these reasons, I consider him to be quite respectable, even if he isn't the most refined. So as always, let's start with Vaughn's place in the plot. Now, Vaughn enters the series from the very first episode, when he, somehow, ends up chasing a dragon into the real world. Now, he has to kill this dragon in order to claim its interest and therefore be deemed worthy to be crowned King of Finalia. This sees him accidentally bring Hitomi along, though, to Gaia, and sees her also attend his coronation, which happens conveniently soon after they both arrived at Finalia. However, due to the machinations of Dornkirk, Finalia is soon burned, and Vaughn is forced to enter Escaflowne to both rescue Hitomi and attempt to rescue his kingdom. Unfortunately, though, he fails and is forced to flee after watching most of his kingdom and many of his closest teachers die before him. This leads to the first meeting with Alan in the swamp. While Alan is initially suspicious in Vaughn's eyes, the two soon grow close together as they work together to reach Palace in order so that Vaughn can ask the king of Astorius for help. Along the way, though, Vaughn is captured, and this sees the first meeting he has with Folken, his older brother. Now, up until this point, Vaughn had simply assumed that Folken was dead and had kind of moved on from that point. Although it isn't quite established in this episode, we will soon learn that Folken and Vaughn were actually quite close as children, and Vaughn did nothing but adore and look up to Folken. As such, this establishes a great betrayal, which kind of emotionally stuns Vaughn in some ways. Although Vaughn is soon rescued from Folken's captivity, and soon joins with Alan and the rest of the group to get to Palace, the capital of Astorius. However, in said capital, Vaughn has another meeting with Folken, which ends up solidifying the rift between the two. Even if Folken does seem to still love his brother, Vaughn sees his brother with nothing but contempt, not quite understanding Folken's place in the world, and not quite accepting many of his views. We will learn over time that both brothers are kind of right and both kind of wrong, and that they do probably reconcile somewhat near the end of the series. However, before this can occur, Dillandau basically chases Vaughn out of the kingdom, and he, along with Hitomi and Merle, flee Palace. Along the way, they end up burning a mine, and this sees Vaughn have to rescue Hitomi from falling down a great chasm. This sees Vaughn reveal his wings, as he must fly, and come out as half-draconian, a race of so-called cursed descendants of Atlantis. Hitomi takes no issue with this, however, and this soon sees Vaughn open up about some of his childhood. It seems that as a child, Vaughn was actually extremely nice and caring, somewhat sheltered in fact, as both his parents and his older brother Folken did their best to ensure that he had a happy childhood. However, with Folken's failure to kill the dragon, and the departure of his mother to go look for Folken, Vaughn's childhood is thrown into disarray, as soon everything around him collapses and he is forced to become king of a kingdom he never thought he would ascend to. This does a good job setting up his character as one that is forced to grow up too quickly and suffers some of the pitfalls associated with it. Back to the plot, Vaughn joins along with the rest of the cast on the way to the Duchy of Freyde in order to defend it from a Zybok attack. This doesn't go too well, however, as he is first arrested by the Duchy's government on suspicions of trying to attack the Duchy, and later proves his innocence only to see near death in the Battle of the Fortuna Temple. Here it is established that in order to get Escaflowne to work, Vaughn has established a blood pact with it, essentially sharing damage with the mech. He is, however, saved when Dryden does agree to pay for repairs to Escaflowne, and thus repairs Vaughn. Feeling 100% again, Vaughn decides to take some retribution, and successfully engages and kills all the Dragon Slayers under Dillandau's command. Although he is about to kill Dillandau, he is prevented from doing this when the ghosts of the fallen Dragon Slayers essentially drag Vaughn to the Shadow Realm. In said Shadow Realm, Vaughn and Hitomi have a spiritual meeting of sorts, where she essentially convinces him that life is worth living and that he needs to move on. while Vaughn is rescued from the Shadow Realm, it does, however, lead him into a sort of slump, as he has to come to terms with having finally killed someone. He eventually does do this, though, and confronts his fear of inadequacy and his fear of combat when he talks to the ghost of Balgus in Atlantis, which he had agreed to accompany Dryden and the rest of the group to. After the visit to Atlantis, he, along with Hitomi and Alan, is transported to Zybok, where honestly not much happens and they manage to escape, and he then regroups with everyone in Asturias. Of course, he's grown quite close to Hitomi by this point, although hasn't quite mastered expressing himself, and so kind of bungles the confession in a rather awkward scene in this windmill. This leads up to the Hitomi scene, and Vaughn basically conceding the victory to Alan, at least for this point. However, Vaughn still wants to work for the greater good, and sticks around in order to both support Dryden's war efforts, and in order to get back at his brother, someone with whom he seems to be personally offended by at this point. In fact, Vaughn's unhealthy desire to get back at his brother starts to border on obsession, and his great mass of pent-up emotions seem to be directed unduly towards Folken. However, he does eventually manage to get the Folken, and Folken's apparent death doesn't really settle much for Vaughn. Folken's death was not confirmed though, and it turns out that he escaped the Finalia, and now seeks to reconcile with his brother in order to sell out Dornkirk. This sees the meeting between the two brothers in the burned out ruins of the kingdom, and it sees Folken impart to Vaughn what he's been trying to tell him. That sometimes conflict isn't the best answer, and that sometimes we must talk and express how we feel in order to understand and move on. This sees the two brothers finally reconcile, and it finally sees Vaughn kind of come to terms with Folken. He tolerates him at this point. He hasn't quite forgiven him. Anyways, Vaughn goes on a few more battles with Alan, one of which Hitomi psychically witnesses through their bond, and this repulses Hitomi enough that she decides to go back to Earth for a little bit. Hitomi and Vaughn, however, still feel for each other quite strongly, and their strong emotions are enough to open the portal back up to Gaia and see Hitomi and Vaughn finally confess to each other and finally stick together. For about a day and a half, as Hitomi gets sent back to the castle so that Vaughn can fight in one last big battle. In said big battle, Vaughn does pretty well, although he does again give into rage as he attempts to kill Dillandau. However, by this point, Dillandau has reverted back to Selena, and Alan steps in order to save his brainwashed sister. He successfully holds off Vaughn, although Vaughn is only convinced to stop once Hitomi reaches out to him from Zybok and says, "Hey, you know what? Your brother had kind of a point. Sometimes we need to talk. This conflict isn't necessary, and you need to stand down." This snaps Vaughn out of his bloodlust, and sees him spread his wings and fly to Zybok in order to be with Hitomi. The stunning sight of which calms down the combatants on the battlefield and essentially ends the war. Busting in the Dornkirk's throne room, Vaughn then embraces Hitomi, as the two finally share each other's feelings for each other and seem to be happy. The next scene sees Vaughn and Hitomi back in Finalia, some point in the future. It's being rebuilt. This is basically the credit scene. And the two confess to each other, as Vaughn finally seems to be comfortable with himself and expressing himself. And while confessing his feelings to Hitomi one more time, he sees her off as she has to return to her world. However, he does make an appearance here, showing that he is still watching over her. With all this in mind, let's look at Vaughn's character. Now, as a character, Vaughn is a rather straightforward one, although this is not a knock on him, and I appreciate the straightforwardness of it. His character development is one that follows a general trend of a young person struggling to deal with having big responsibilities foisted upon them, and the resultant big emotions that come with this, although he ultimately does step up to the task at hand and grow into quite a good young man. Vaughn is a great example of a young man learning how to juggle responsibility with his own limitations and emotions, of someone learning how to balance caring for others with caring for himself, and of impulse and the desire to do good with the calculation and restraint necessary to make sure that all actions are planned accordingly for the best possible outcome. In a sense, Vaughn is a character that learns to express himself, accumulating with opening up to Hitomi and probably forgiving Folken. At the core of Vaughn's character is the idea of responsibility, and balancing one's own needs with the needs that others have of them. As a king, Vaughn must think not only of himself, but also of his state and of his people. Although Vaughn never asked for these responsibilities, and honestly didn't expect them since Folken was supposed to be king, he does see how important they are, and attempts his best in order to meet them. To this end, Vaughn has an excellent work ethic and a surprisingly strong, but not unbreakable, sense of empathy. He is willing to seek and accept help from others, and is always trying to improve himself or the general state of affairs. He is in fact consumed by this drive of his, and in this lies some of his imperfections. While Vaughn is a young man trying extremely hard at all times, this does cause himself to wear himself thin. In a sense, his obsessive quest to be the best king possible is, as a byproduct, a quest to grow up as quickly as possible in order to be a good king. And this does cause some undesirable traits to appear. Starting with on the most surface level, Vaughn lacks the confidence of someone who has had all the time and experience necessary to be a good ruler. As someone who is quite young and as someone who is essentially learning on the job, he does deal with a sense of inadequacy which crops up from time to time. Although it never quite cripples his character, it is one which lurks in the background, and it does lead him to question both his own judgment sometimes and his own course of action. As a result, while he is a decent king at the beginning, he is one which doesn't necessarily have any sense of direction, even after his kingdom has been burned. I mean, there is a general plot here. He wants to get back at Folken, and he wants to prevent Zybok from taking out any other kingdoms, but that's about it. His inadequacy haunts him as he questions if he's doing the right thing, especially since his course of action isn't necessarily 100% thought out. This also leads to a fear of battle, which again, Escaflowne says that combat is not glorious. However, Vaughn's conversation with Balgus does tell us that sometimes confrontation, at least in self-defense, is necessary, and sometimes we must step up to the hard facts of life, something which Vaughn is trying very hard to do, but does not manage to do 100% of the time. He does, however, learn to overcome this sense of inadequacy and become a more confident version of himself. This, however, is not always for the best, as it does feed into his rather impulsive nature. Now, Vaughn is never stupid, and he's never portrayed as stupid, although he does give in to impulses from time to time when he loses patience and thinks he can simply blunt force a solution, or if he simply gets frustrated. He does give in to emotional urges, even when they may be the best for him, or if they may not be very rational. We see this multiple times throughout the series, whether it's his unhealthily strong desire to kill his brother, or if he's just flying around blowing up mines. The point here is that the pressure of the responsibilities of being king see Vaughn look for the quickest solutions possible, even if they're not the most rational. He has forced himself to become a man of action, though he hasn't quite mastered the self-control and planning necessary to make sure that every action is a calculated one. In addition, Vaughn tends to subconsciously bury his emotions in order to remain as composed and kingly as possible. He knows that others are depending on him and doesn't want to risk failing them through some emotional fault of his own. He wants to remain as strong as possible in order to serve them and sees emotional breakdown or emotional expression as a possible weakness that could hinder this task. As such, he tends to get rather wound up from time to time, as a young person essentially being forced to grow up. Vaughn tries to be an adult without all of the emotional development gained along the way of becoming an adult. The straining circumstances around him force him to step up before he's quite emotionally ready to, and to compensate, he kind of just ignores his emotions, and while this does keep his head in the game, it also means he tends to come off as aloof and even rude sometimes, even though he really isn't. This also means that there's a concentrated knot of repressed emotions at his core, and since these emotions aren't expressed consistently, they tend to build up and contribute to impulsive decisions from time to time, when his emotional stress level passes the level of self-control that he has installed over himself. While Vaughn is established as flawed though, he isn't doomed, and he does do quite a bit of learning throughout the series. In fact, him learning to control his emotions and impulses, with Hitomi's help of course, is a great arc for him. While Vaughn remains impulsive up until the last episode, it's obvious that Hitomi has had a good influence on him, and he genuinely cares for her, as it's shown that he is slowly learning to control his impulses with her guidance. He is learning self-control, and part of this is opening up to others, something he initially struggles with. At first it may seem odd that someone so blunt as Vaughn may have trouble opening up, but it does make a lot of sense in context. In context, Vaughn is someone who lives with a sense of betrayal due to Folken's fate, and the fact that Folken later ended up joining Dornkirk. Now, it is established later on that Folken did this because he basically had to. I mean, realistically, Dornkirk did literally save his life and agrees with him on some surface points of ideology, so him joining Dornkirk kinda made sense. However, Vaughn doesn't know a lot of this, and that doesn't change the fact that Folken was there for the burning of the kingdom, which, that's a pretty big betrayal. This perceived betrayal on Folken's part makes Vaughn very wary of opening up to anyone else. As mentioned earlier, it has been established that the two brothers were very close growing up. To Vaughn, if his beloved brother betrayed him, then surely anyone else could. And while he doesn't handle this horribly, he isn't inherently distrustful or rude, he is quite walled off from others and as a result has trouble expressing himself. This is a sort of emergency maneuver that Vaughn imposed upon himself in order to grow up as quickly as possible. Vaughn never really got over Folken's fate, and he never really got over the loss of a brother that he loved so much growing up. And so, he just kind of ignores how he feels and sulks over it every now and again in order not to be completely consumed by his sense of loss and his sense of betrayal. He's kind of putting a band-aid over this instead of addressing it in order to remain as resilient as possible. As the series progresses though, and Vaughn becomes more open and dependent and enamored with Hitomi, he does soften up and is in turn starts to express himself. The biggest turning point after he rescues her and shows her his wings, something which he is not supposed to do, as it's not supposed to be known that he's half draconian. This is a great metaphor as while he physically opens up, i.e. he literally spreads his wings, he also shares something which is incredibly secret and in a sense is kind of forced to open up emotionally. He tells Hitomi the story of his parents, the story of his relationship with Folken, and just general personal information. The fact that she takes it so well, and that the fact that she seems to adore his wings, enforces to him that maybe opening up to others is okay. Maybe I can trust others with how I feel. Maybe there's no need to be so uptight all the time. This trend continues as the two fall more and more in love with each other and eventually confess each other's feelings. In fact, while the couple isn't really official until the very end of the series, there is a lot of groundwork laid for it throughout the series, and it is consistent. Vaughn seems to like Hitomi because she provides not only practical skills, i.e. dowsing and that kind of thing, but also emotional support, and because, as someone who's basically alone in this new world, understands what it's like to be without what you're used to. Vaughn, in this case, having lost his kingdom and his family. Hitomi, meanwhile, sees someone who, that while impulsive, is genuinely caring, and is genuinely trying his best to do the best. She appreciates that, and she appreciates the fact that he struggles, but admittedly does, open up to her. She can see that it's difficult for him, and does appreciate the effort that he puts into doing so. This sets up the two to get along quite well and eventually fall in love with each other, as Hitomi learns how Vaughn feels, and Vaughn learns how to express how he feels. He learns that talking about emotion is important, and that sometimes speech is just as important as action. He needs to express himself, and learns how to do so with Hitomi's help in order to become the king he's always wanted to be. Welcome everyone to the final character examination of the Vision of Escaflowne retrospective. We're going to be looking at the main character of the series, Hitomi Kanzaki. Now as a main character, Hitomi is a little unique, as while combat is a big feature in some episodes of Escaflowne, she doesn't actually take active part in it. In fact, she seems to hate violence, and is almost always a non-combatant. This does not negate her importance though, and the story manages to consistently center on her, as it is her story after all, and provides her with meaningful interactions and actions to take, both in regards to other characters and to the plot in general. Overall, her character is a great exercise in writing a main character that is not the main combatant. While some may argue that Vaughn or Alan may be considered the quote main combatant of the series, it's clear that they're not the main character, and Hitomi always maintains her place at the center of the story as we watch it unfold from her perspective. While writing a story with a lot of physical conflict, starring a character which doesn't really fight is a challenge, just look at Kiara from Samurai 7 for example, Escaflowne does it very well here, as Hitomi is realistic and involved enough to maintain her presence without simply being turned into some overpowered and unrealistic super protagonist. In fact, as a whole, Hitomi's writing masterfully walks a very fine line between being realistic and likable, and capable and productive. While she doesn't really fight, she is still enduring and involved, contributing much to the story and its themes from both a logistical standpoint and from a thematic standpoint. She manages to draw the series together and provide a beating heart to it, which we will examine in a bit. Before we do though, we must ask, what does she do in this plot? As with previous videos, this plot summary is bullet pointed, and it's going to be as quick as possible in order to get to the main content of the episode, since Hitomi is the main character, and that there's a lot that she does and is involved with. So if I skip a few things, or if something's a little out of order, please forgive me. Now, Hitomi Kanzaki is introduced in episode 1 as a girl who is very interested in the track captain Amano. In fact, she's so interested to him, she asks him to meet her after school in order to see if she can beat her personal best running time. If she does, she asks him to kiss her. However, in the middle of this run, she sees Vaughn, who is teleported from Gaia to the real world, along with a dragon he's fighting to establish himself as king. Now, Hitomi and her high school friends run away from this fight, as is logical, although she does end up running back to warn Vaughn of a fatal strike and ends up saving him so that he can kill the dragon. He lifts up the dragon's energist in a proclamation of victory. However, this takes Hitomi along with him back to Gaia. This first episode does a good job of establishing Hitomi as clairvoyant and brave, but not necessarily as overpowered or super combative. From here, she accompanies Vaughn to his coronation, and is unfortunately also present for the attack on Finalia, although she does manage to teleport herself and Vaughn out of Finalia when they are seemingly surrounded. After being rescued by Alan Schezar in the swamp, she then warns him and those in the castle of an impending Zybok attack. While this is ignored for a bit, it does prove to ring true, and Hitomi goes on to tag along with Alan and Vaughn on their way to the capital of Astoria's palace. This leads us into about the first third of the series, where Hitomi basically tags along with Vaughn and saves him on numerous occasions and teaches him numerous things via her precognitive powers. Her ability to predict the future and see visions of possible outcomes motivates her to often go out of her way to warn Vaughn and in turn avert disaster. She indirectly saves him many times, and in return, he directly saves her many times, often with the help of Escaflowne. This helps the two grow closer along the way, as they generally kind of just travel around the lands. It is during this time that she also meets Millerna for the first time and establishes what is, in the beginning, a rather tense and catty relationship. Anyways, after a failed kidnapping, she is forced to flee the kingdom along with Vaughn, and they head to Freed, along the way sharing some personal details about each other and generally just growing closer. In Freed, she next teaches Vaughn about dowsing, and she, Vaughn, and the rest of the cast are suspected of being double agents. However, she does single-handedly manage to expose the Black-Towed doppelganger and basically mentally break him. In the process, I'd like to point out that she literally dies though, and we also get to see the fact that she's very empathetic, as even though she foresees the death of the faker, she goes out of her way to try and prevent it. This allows the group to establish their innocence and have some downtime between the next big battle. It is during this time that her pacifist desires start to be more espoused, as while Vaughn seems very enthusiastic for combat applications of dowsing, Hitomi is very hesitant and doesn't like being seen as a weapon or tool. After the failed battles of both the capital Godashim and the Fortuna Temple, Vaughn is then horribly wounded because Escaflowne is. This of course leads to resentment against the Dragon Slayers, and he goes on his quest to basically destroy them. This of course though sees the incident where he's dragged to the Shadow Realm. Hitomi, however, travels there with him and is able to break him out of his stupor. She then goes along with the group to Atlantis and ends up saving both Alan and Vaughn from various sort of mental journeys. While she does this, she also manages to exposition dump by reading this stone tablet here, giving a lot of lore relevant to the world of Gaia. There's also this scene where she talks to her Vaughn's mother, I believe, about the negative use of her fortune-telling abilities. Something we'll touch on later. This scene is very awkward and it does deserve some conversation. Anyways, after the Atlantis trip, they are then teleported to Zybok briefly, where she helps Vaughn escape, along with Alan, after calling out Dornkirk's twisted message and desires. With everyone regrouped in Palace, she then goes to Millerna to discourage her arranged marriage, although she does give in to Millerna's request for a reading, and then into the temptation of kind of trying to fudge the numbers in order to persuade Millerna that Dryden is the best choice, so that Alan is still available. She, however, instantly regrets this and feels quite bad about it, although she is rather quickly forgiven once the wedding is crashed. With this wedding in place though, Millerna is now taken and Alan kind of goes through his sad phase, and simultaneously, Dornkirk and Folken conspire to set Hitomi up with someone else in order to get her away from Vaughn. This sees the weird fate manipulation scene where she's basically shipped with Alan. We've covered this in the Alan episode and why it's weird. Although I do want to point out that Hitomi also says that it's weird in the series, and does actively say, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. She then gets kidnapped, although basically convinces her kidnapper to let her go, and this is a good scene as it establishes her empathy. She then next teams up with Vaughn to go meet with Folken, simply because she wants to see the brothers reconcile, although this does arouse suspicion from Alan. After talking to Folken though, and generally just hanging around the kingdom while the war preparations are being done, She witnesses a big fight that Vaughn partakes in via their psychic bond. This distresses her greatly, as Vaughn does seem to enjoy some of it, and as a result, she kind of just teleports herself home. Although this doesn't last long, as her desire to be with Vaughn finally makes its way to its surface, and she and Vaughn recreate the acts of the first episode in order to reunite. Reunited, she then goes to Folken and along with him teleports to Dornkirk in order to stop the final battle. Folken kills Dornkirk of course during this exchange, but unfortunately dies, and a distressed Hitomi may or may not activate the fate machine. It seems to activate when she's distressed, although it's not clear if that's because it's of happenstance or if it's one caused the other. She collects herself and calls upon Vaughn mentally, telling him that the fighting is not necessary and that she realizes how she feels about him. Their bond cemented, Vaughn then realizes that conflict is not what this life is all about, and flies to her as the two embrace, and the sight of him flying away ends up calming the combatants and basically ending the war. The final scene sees her talk to Vaughn one last time, as the two establish that they will never forget each other, although Hitomi does have to go home. Hitomi returns home, and after having mentioned that she no longer believes in fortune-telling, looks out over the sea to see Vaughn still lovingly watching over her. With Hitomi's place in the plot explored, we can now look at what she contributes to the production as a whole, and that contribution is a heart. Hitomi serves as the beating heart of the group, helping others get by, and providing certain practical skills when applicable. Now, as you might have noticed, I didn't necessarily go over a lot of relationship details in the plot summary portion of this video, mostly because I found it easier to simply summarize them in a compact little section, as opposed to go over every detail in chronological order, as that might get a little messy, seeing as that Hitomi is the main character, and a lot of things happen not necessarily at the same time. We'll start with her relationship with Millerna. Now, Hitomi's relationship with Millerna does start off on a bad foot, as Millerna kind of picks on her a little, and Hitomi is kind of annoyed with this arrogance that Millerna seems to bring to the table. However, as the two venture around more, they soon start to come to an understanding, and they soon find out that, in reality, they're both young women trying to find themselves, and even though they may see each other as competition from time to time, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be friends and that they can't respect each other. By the end of the series, in fact, Millerna seems to look up to Hitomi actually, and I really love this moment here where they kind of have a bonding moment after the mutual discovery of Alan's shady pasts. I feel like it really cements their bond, especially after Millerna forgives Hitomi for quote-unquote sabotaging the wedding. On the topic of Alan, Hitomi's relationship with him is a little weird. Now, we went into this in a lot more detail on the Alan video, where we basically explained that his insecurities prevent him from forming healthy relationships, and it is kind of weird considering that there is a 6-year age gap between the two, one of them being over 18 and the other one not. In general, from the beginning of the plot, Hitomi kind of sees Alan as the knight in shining armor, and is attracted to him for that reason, although, going along with the deconstruction of fantasy tropes present in the series, this is proven throughout the series to be kind of a red herring, and that Alan is not actually the right person for Hitomi, and she simply needs to overcome her naive fantasies, like we the viewers must, in order to really find out who she should be with, i.e. Vaughn. Now this relationship is the corner piece of the series, and it is the accumulation of a series of interactions that the two have from the very first episode. While Vaughn is initially gruff and Hitomi initially fails to see past his aloof exterior, over time as the two venture across Gaia and share more personal thoughts and past experiences with each other, they soon come to value each other's company. Vaughn of course values Hitomi for the practical skills she provides, although he really does care about her not only as a friend, but also as a lover. He feels obligated to get her home, and although he does value genuinely being with her, and he does genuinely love her, seeing how supportive and open she is, how emotionally expressive she is, something which is very valuable to a man like him who is very closed off. Hitomi, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily see Vaughn's feelings at first, although she does come to appreciate them once he starts to present them more openly, and once it's obvious that Alan is not necessarily the perfect knight that he appears to be. In fact, throughout the story, Vaughn's ability to express himself increases directly thanks to Hitomi's help and interactions with him, and as a result, they grow closer and closer because he is more able to express himself with Hitomi's help. This all accumulates, of course, with their grand reunion in episode 24, and their final proclamation of being together, at least mentally, forever, in the final episode. Now, while all of these relationships are unique, there is a few similarities that they all have that I do want to point out real quick. And that is that Hitomi helps all of these people a great deal in her own way. In Millerna's case, Hitomi teaches her how to be warmer and more humble and down to earth. In Alan's case, Hitomi's refusal of him after a few episodes teaches him that he can make it on his own and that maybe he should take some time to review himself before trying to get into a relationship, that he probably should actually find himself before trying to find someone else. And of course with Vaughn, she helps him become more emotionally expressive and more open, finally accumulating with him being able to directly tell her how she feels and to feel young love. Hitomi's great ability to empathize with others is her greatest power at the end of the day, as it helps people not only relate to her, but also express themselves more clearly and grow more in touch with who they are as an individual. While she doesn't fight that much, that's fine, because the Vision of Escaflowne isn't about the cool mech fights. It's about exploring one's heart and learning to listen to it, and that's exactly what Hitomi does. Through her journey, we see the journey of a young person learning to explore who they are and how they feel about things, how to express themselves, and how they want to express themselves and carry on around others. We learn that sometimes the heart may not always know what it wants, but if we cautiously follow it, we can get a vague idea and use that to guide ourselves towards greater goals. As we guide ourselves, we start to learn more about ourselves and how to use our own agency to make our own fate. Of course, there will be setbacks, and what we may want may not be originally what we imagine it to be, but there will be progress as long as we remain resolute. Hitomi's character arc explains why she's so important to the series. She's important because she is the character that establishes the power that we all have over our own destiny, and that we can exercise this power while being a good person. Now initially, the power that Hitomi seems to have is set up to be fortune-telling and dowsing and her precognitive abilities, or clairvoyant skills. However, Escaflowne does go out of its way to say that while these skills may or may not be real, Escaflowne is kind of nebulous on whether or not fortune-telling is legit in-universe, that they shouldn't necessarily be relied upon, because at the end of the day, people should make their own fates with their own hands, with their own agency, doing what they think is right. The series does go about this a little oddly, because instead of simply establishing that false prophecies are bad, or establishing that people can kind of psych themselves into doing certain things, Vaughn's mother, for some reason, shows up and tells Hitomi that, hey, your fortune telling is literally creating bad outcomes by literally forcing the future into a certain way. Now, this is a very odd statement because the show is pretty subtle with the theme of making one's own destiny for most of the time, so I found it really odd that there is a scene where the character literally says, hey, this is your fault. I also didn't like the fact that it implied that all the bad stuff that's happened is a result of Hitomi's fortune telling. I understand that they're saying that you shouldn't turn to superstition or something when you're scared, because that can cause you to act irrationally, and that can cause you to act out of fear and make poor decisions. I understand that that's the point they're trying to get across. However, instead of saying, hey, you're acting irrationally and that's affecting your judgment, they say, hey, you're literally manipulating fate, which is a bit on the nose for me. Again, this is going back to that scene with Vaughn's mother that I didn't particularly care for, although I do see what they're doing. I do see what the series is saying, and it's saying that you have to exercise your own power and control your own fate. And this is what Hitomi does, and she's a great character for doing it, as she's realistic and not necessarily a pushover, but still a decent person who listens to her moral compass and tries to be friendly, or at least nice, decent to those around her. The fact that she walks this line so well is a testament to the writing of the series, and it does a good job establishing her as a relatable protagonist who, while not super involved in a lot of the action scenes, is still quite impactful. If Hitomi was too nice, or unrealistically forgiving, or positive, or something like that, it'd be kind of hard to relate to her, because she does see some not very good things in the series. If this was the case, we could easily dismiss her as an unrelatable cardboard cutout of a saint. If she went in the complete opposite direction, say she was all about her agency, and ended up discarding her moral compass in the process to use it as efficiently as possible, she would also be less relatable, and perhaps not even a good protagonist by that point. She's neither a cardboard cutout of a saint, though, or a Sigma, as she's never afraid to express herself, although she never gets carried away with it. She knows who she is and how she feels, and she tells others, but it doesn't affect her judgment to any point of irrationality. She's very human, and therefore very relatable. But she doesn't become irrational or impulsive to the point where she's less likable. As a young person simply trying to navigate life and figure it out what it is that she truly wants, which is something I'm sure we will all have to do or have already done, Hitomi serves as a good example of self-discovery. Part of this self-discovery, of course, is her abandoning of fortune-telling and instead relying on herself to make her own identity. While Escaflowne, again, never really establishes how legit fortune-telling is in universe, it does blatantly establish the notion that we need to make our own fates, and that if we do not, we essentially resign ourselves to an unhappy one or a less than optimal one. Hitomi proves this multiple times, whether she's using her visions to take action and avert a foreseen disaster, or even when she bails from Alan's odd grasp. In fact, she's very proactive even if she never really fights. If she sees an outcome that she doesn't like, she goes out of her way to try and change it, to try and make her own fate. She goes on to prove that yes, fate would have been made had she not done anything, but by doing something, she can mold it into a better fate. Through her, we see the need and effectiveness of exercising our own abilities and talents, as opposed to simply letting stuff happen. And I would say that this is how she truly opens the eyes of the viewers, and really cements her role as the Vision of Escaflowne. Now, Escaflowne of course is the mech of the series, which explains why it's in the title, but the word Vision may seem a little out of place. Hitomi, however, is the Vision. The true Vision named in the series is not the mere sight of the mech, or the literal sight of the unseen which Hitomi's abilities provide, but instead the vision in the one's own heart, the ability to look within and passionately strive for a better future instead of simply letting one happen. And this is exactly what Hitomi teaches us. She knows that she's not the most physically powerful, however she knows that she still can affect the world around her, and that she can make a contribution to help those around her, that she can make a positive contribution to society regardless of what she does on the battlefield. And it is this contribution which positively affects both herself and those around her, that positively make her own fate and mold the outcomes of her interactions with the world for the best possible outcome. Hitomi isn't just some princess waiting to be rescued, and isn't just some bystander who watches the fate of the kingdom unfold before her. Instead, she's an active participant who takes part in the process of deciding the fate of both herself and her friends and her loved ones and the kingdom. She is the vision of someone who has learned to use their own agency and attachments and bonds and passions to shape their own future, instead of letting fate dictate it to them. Hitomi, though, is not the final character that we're going to talk on, though, as there is a great tertiary cast present in this series as well, and I thought that we should spend a few minutes talking about them, too. Now, Vision of Escaflowne has a rather wide cast of tertiary characters, and while none of them really deserve a video on their own, I do feel that they should be mentioned, as like any tertiary cast, they really do help to flesh out the world of the series and to make it more identifiable and relatable to the viewer. Starting off with the least significant and working our way up, we have bit roles, like that of King Aston. Now, this is Millerna's dad and the King of Asturias. He's in most of the series, although he doesn't necessarily have any prominent roles, other than being the guy who tells Millerna, "You are going to marry Dryden." He represents a kind of authoritative and forceful heir. He's very shrewd and at times callous, although this does seem to partially be in part due to the death of Marlene, whom he did seem to genuinely love. He does tend to put the kingdom first, and as a result, he makes decisions which are not necessarily taken very well by those that he makes them at the expense at, particularly Millerna, whom he decides to dictate her decisions to instead of letting her make her own decisions. He is a bit overbearing, although while he isn't very likable, he does seem realistic to me. The moves he makes, whether that's submitting the Zybok, to arranging dynastic marriages, to trying to help Vaughn and then immediately selling him out when it proves too costly, all seem like things a real medieval ruler would do. I don't necessarily like him, but I don't necessarily think that's the point. I will say that everything he does feel logical, and he seems, if not a cold and callous ruler, then probably a competent one. Next is Gaddis Kaio and Brooklyn Vinny, I don't think that's his real name, and the rest of Alan's knights. These guys are cool. They're just competent soldiers following orders and getting the job done. They generally go everywhere the main cast does, although as supporting characters, of course, they don't necessarily get many roles or scenes to themselves. Maybe a comedy scene here or there, and I think Gaddis does have a few, parting bits of scenes focused on him. Gaddis himself does show him to be rather trustworthy, a solid second-in-command in the brief times that he gets to show this. Again, he never really gets a scene to himself. And in the English version of Escaflowne, Alan's crew isn't necessarily super fleshed out, Although I do like that in the Japanese version, everyone calls everyone else a bum. This of course is done in good fun, and it really does make it seem like this is just a bunch of guys just kind of giving each other grief while on the job. It makes them seem chummier, and it just makes them seem warmer, I guess, and more fun. On the topic of chums, their next is Aria and Neria, Vulcan's cat assassins, the Leopard Sisters. I think these characters are a great example of tertiary staff, as they're very defined in their presence, in their character, in their actions, and their motivations, in spite of their limited screen time. It does seem that they're very attached to Folken, to the point where they will recklessly put their lives on the line in order to serve him. However, they do so out of a genuine gratitude, and this helps establish Folken as not a cold psychopath. In fact, in some ways they are relatable, and it makes sense why they would follow Folken. They were persecuted by a world that just had it out for them, and they were taken in by this man who simply wanted to give them another chance. Again, this helps flesh out Folken, and their own presence in the series is one of danger, I guess. It's kind of hard to sum up in words, but they do have a very noticeable presence, and they also show Vaughn that his brother is not a psychopath, and their death, due to Dornkirk's lack of empathy, help finally push Folken to betray Dornkirk. Another set of lives drastically affected by Dornkirk's callous actions are those of the Chads of Frayed. Yes, I said Chads plural, as both these guys seem pretty cool. Mahad Zur Freed is the original Duke of Freed, and while not initially likable, I found him to be quite respectable. At first he comes off as a little severe, although it's made pretty clear later on that he's just trying to hold everything down in a time of crisis, and that he really does love Sheed. He does, however, know that his son is going to inherit great responsibility, and wants to raise him in a strict enough manner to make sure that he can take the pressure when it's applied to him. He really comes off as sort of an old world dad, I guess. He isn't super warm, and it's obvious that he isn't super emotional, but he definitely has a heart, and he definitely loves his family, as proven by the fact that he A, accepted Marlene in spite of her having Alan's child, and he genuinely seemed to love her, and B, that he raised said child, Sheed, as his very own. While he isn't always the warmest towards Sheed, it seems he's just trying to raise him in a strict manner to prepare him for the title of Duke, which he will inherit. It's obvious that he loves him, and he definitely trusts him to lead too, as seen by the fact that he accepts his death knowing that Sheed will make a good ruler in his stead. He does trust him by the end of his time on screen. He also gets bonus points for single-handedly calling out Zybok and telling them to fight man to man. I mean, this is really dumb, but it's also really epic and brave. Sheed, for his part, is also worthy of respect for his conduct. I mean, this guy's like 7 tops, and yet he conducts himself with more maturity and self-control than some of the main cast at times. He understands that he's got a lot of responsibilities, and that his dad and his nation and everyone is depending on him, and trusting him to carry the team once he inherits the throne. And for the most part, it seems he does. Yeah, he cries a little, but I mean, who probably wouldn't in this scenario? More importantly, he doesn't give up and he stays strong. He knows that even though he's lost the fight at the Fortuna Temple and basically has to submit to Zybok, that that's not the end of his country, and that he has to remain around for his people in order to try and eventually liberate them, or at least make life under Zybok more tolerable. While Sheed would probably benefit from talking to someone about his trauma later in life, it's no doubt that, like his dad, he's also a Chad. Next up is the part that was originally dedicated to Leon, Alan's dad. However, like in the series, he happened to run out. Instead, he ended up alone and got his own video. It's the one where I ranted about him. I don't like this guy. He's a douche, and I don't know why the series holds up a man who ruined his family so highly. It's very confusing to me. If you want to learn more about him and his odd writing / tone, he got his own video linked in this convenient card here. He's just a... Going back to the script, next is Merle. I don't really know how to handle this character, as on one hand she seemed very important. I mean, she is in every episode after all, and does have occasional important moments. But on the other hand, for the most part, she's just a cat. I mean, like any cat, she can be very warm or very petty, and she does seem to be quite temperamental at times. She does have a few critical moments, like when she protects Vaughn from the Leopard Sisters, and when she tells Hitomi to sort out her own feelings, but for the most part, she's just like a cat. I know this might be an unpopular opinion. I'm sure Merle has fans out there, but She's just doing cat stuff a lot of the time. I mean, she definitely affects the moods of many of the scenes she's in. She definitely warms up a lot of the scenes by either comforting Vaughn, or trying to talk to some other character, or establishing their empathy, or even serving as comic relief, but that's all I really can think of on the topic of her character. I mean, her relationship with Hitomi is quite interesting and developed. It's probably the longest running in the series and feels very natural and nice, but again, she's just a cat 90% of the time, so I didn't really know how to make a video about her work or even necessarily feel it was needed. So, next character. Finally, here we are. We get to Mole Man. I finally get to talk about this guy. Mole Man is so fascinating to me as he is one of, if not the weirdest part of the entire series to me. Like, this guy, he just shows up randomly. He'll make or do something that makes a massive change or adjustment to the plot or some character development, and then he just disappears again until he's needed. He never talks to anyone outside of when he makes massive changes to the plot. He never really does anything unless it's to affect the plot. And no one even mentions this guy's name. No one knows who this guy is. They say Mr. Mole. That's about all we get. But for some reason, everyone seems to trust this guy, and even if they didn't, he always figures out a way to tag along anyways. He's critical to the plot and many character developments along the way, but he never has a plot or scene of his own. It's to the point where it seems to pass unintentionally bad writing, and I'm wondering if it crosses over into intentionally mysterious writing. Like, this guy's amount of screen time is so little that it doesn't even feel like he's tagged on, because it's not even enough to really make that complaint about. He just kind of shows up and then makes a big change and then leaves. Like, what's this guy's deal? Why is he so important? Why does he always happen to be around when needed? How is he the guy exercising almost more agency than some of the characters, the cast sometimes? Is he a self-insert for some writer or something? What is the point of Mole Man? He just raises so many questions. He moves the plot along, and then he disappears until he's needed again. It may seem really weird, but I do list him as the most important tertiary cast for a reason, as he really does shape the entire plot of the series throughout the entire running of the series. If you don't believe me, here are just a few examples proving this, and I'm sure I'm leaving some out. He provides life-saving Glar leaves to Vaughn in episode 3 to save Merle. He snitches on Millerna when she gets Alan out of jail, which forces her in turn to start her own journey of self-discovery on her own. Later, he also convinces Millerna to try surgery on Alan, both boosting her confidence and saving a member of the main cast's life. Mole Man later hints to Millerna not to marry Dryden, prompting her to get a reading from Hitomi and kicking off that interaction. He tells the rest of the cast that Vaughn and Hitomi went to Finalia to go find Folken, which furthers Alan's distrust of Hitomi and leads to more awkwardness in that relationship, eventually culminating in her departure. And these are just some highlights of Mole Man's actions. Again, he's almost never in the series, but every time he shows up, something big happens, probably mostly indirectly due to him. For some reason, Mole Man is just kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time, molding the plot, shaping the characters, and yet not really having a plot or character of his own. It's just very curious to me, and I want to know more about this guy. However, with him, that's just about all of the tertiary cast of Escaflowne. Again, while none of these characters really deserved a standalone video in my eyes, it is important to mention them, as, like any series, the tertiary cast is an important touch which can really flesh out and enhance a series, and that's exactly what these characters do. They add a layer of relatability and realism, showing that even the quote-unquote unimportant can have a drastic and positive impact on the world around us, around them. They show that everyone has some value or impact, and that anyone can influence the world in some way, shape, or form. And on a logistical standpoint, they really do just help make the world of Gaia seem more fleshed out and warm. The presence of these small bit pieces make us feel more included in the story itself as we play our own role in life. In this way, they really do help to enhance the true Vision of Escaflowne. Having finally talked about all the characters that make this series so good and memorable, I think it's time that we touch on the central theme of the story, which also does the same. And that central theme which the series predicates itself upon is of course exploring the idea of fate and how it plays into our lives. Now, Escaflowne explores this in several different ways, and from several different angles, although it mostly hovers around the idea of questioning whether or not fate is something which is completely uncontrolled and predetermined, or something that we can shape ourselves with our own agency. In this way, it kind of compares and contrasts predicting the future versus making one's own future. And along the way, it also talks about important ideas of self-discovery, self-control, and what one actually desires. And I'd like to also include a quick disclaimer saying that since the Vision of Escaflowne kind of only has one central theme of it, that of its discussion of fate, I'm not the first to talk about it. I just say that because I think that those who have come before me should receive their due respect, and I don't want to step on any toes. Just looking at the central debate of the series, which is predicting one's future versus making the future, Escaflowne is pretty evident in what it says. And what it says is that we need to use our own agency to make our own future. Now, I've said this in about half of the videos in this retrospective by this point, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse. I'm just going to try and make a nice brief summary of it, and that is that every character in the series at some point or another learns of their ability to manipulate fate as opposed to simply taking it for granted. Hitomi, yes, can see possible outcomes, however, none of them actually come true because she goes out of her way to prevent them. She uses her agency to shape her own fate, and this prevents her from resigning herself to fate and therefore maintaining some kind of self-control. Now, the Vision of Escaflowne does make it clear that you cannot control everything in your life, and that sometimes you will just have to take the L, which a lot of characters do sometimes. However, there are many things that you can control, and doing so is ideal in order to help shape your future for the better. One cannot simply think that their fate is already sealed, as if they do, they kind of create a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that by resigning themselves to the idea of an unchangeable fate, they don't use their agency as they should, and thus make a fate that, well, isn't changed because they didn't decide to do anything about it. And that's basically the central theme of the show, that we gotta use our own agency to make the best possible fate, and that fate is not some nebulous thing which is predetermined and that we cannot control, but instead a very fluid construct that we can manipulate with our own agency, although we must also appreciate that others may try to do the same. In line with this is a discussion on the ideas of self-discovery and self-control, that what one may want is not necessarily what they may think it is or want the most. Now, this is a pretty prevalent theme throughout the entire series, and we see it in many of the characters. Hitomi at first is just a young woman who thinks she wants to date track Captain Amano, and then meets Alan and thinks she wants to be with him, but as she learns more about herself, more about Alan, more about her own tastes, and refrains from doing anything too crazy, she learns that, no, I think Vaughn is the right guy. I think this is who I want to talk to and be with, because even though I didn't initially see it, he is the one that is the best fit for me. We see this in other characters too, like Vaughn, who learns self-control, and this in turn allows him to be a better king. We see this a lot in Alan, who even though he doesn't necessarily do a lot of soul-searching, we see that making hasty leaps in his case is harmful, as he kind of has an awkward relationship with Hitomi, and it's pretty clear that he's hurt himself, or has been hurt in the past. And he doesn't even really know what he wants other than to not be alone. A very vague goal in this case. What the series is saying is that if you really want to know what you want in life, you really have to know who you are as an individual. And as that is a process which takes time and certain levels of effort, it's pretty okay and common to not necessarily know what you want right off the bat, as you still have a vague idea of who you are and thus aren't quite sure of the details of what exactly it is you want. However, by using your own agency and exploring your own preferences and your tastes, and maintaining and building some kind of self-confidence, you can eventually figure out what it is you want, or at least get a better idea, and then proceed to pursue it by using your own agency to shape your own fate. And this is really what the Vision of Escaflowne is all about. Now, as a fantasy piece, Escaflowne is set up to explore this idea of fate from the opposite direction. There are many fate tropes about prophecy, or unchangeable destiny, or star-crossed love, and all these other things of just universal or cosmic forces beyond human comprehension or control. It's very interesting how Escaflowne seems to be set up to go in accord with this. Hitomi can read the future, she can see the future. There is this idea of fate is just kind of guiding things along early on in the series. However, this is just a clever ruse to get the viewer in, and then slowly start to prove itself wrong. As the series progresses, we see people start to change fate. In fact, we see Hitomi do this from episode 1, when she saves Vaughn after seeing a possible future in which he is hurt. Escaflowne, in fact, subverts the entire fate trope of universal, cosmic, unchangeable destiny very thoroughly, and I think that's the point of the series. As a whole, the series wants us to take control of as much of our own destiny as we can. Again, you can't necessarily control all of it, but you can do a lot more than you think, and that's what the series is telling us. I think that's a great theme, especially for a show like this. Getting a little meta for a moment, the Vision of Escaflowne, of course, is a fantasy piece, and while I would recommend it for basically anyone that wants a nice fantasy adventure, just a nice adventure in general, the show has something for everyone. It is at least seemingly aimed at, a young adult audience, I would think. And I think this is a great message for people who are still learning about themselves and how they fit in the society and how they want to live their lives, because it says you don't have to give in to whatever tropes you think you're put into. You don't have to be the guy on the box if you don't want to be. You can be yourself. And a common argument or a common issue with that is, what if you don't know who you are? Well, that's okay too, because as you discover yourself, as you learn more about yourself, as you grow more confident in yourself, you will eventually start to hash out the details. And of course, everything is a work in progress, and you shouldn't get too down if it's not resolved overnight. And I just want to say that I think that's a great theme for any young adult in any age. Coming of age is very difficult, and at least in my case, I don't really think I knew who I was until I was about 26? 25, 26. You've been working since 18, but you don't really know who you are until a little while longer. You get more responsibilities, some stuff happens, you get married, and eventually you just know who you are. It kind of just clicks at some point. At least it did in my case. But until you get there, you're kind of insecure about things. You don't really know if you're on the right path, and you question stuff, and that's perfectly okay. And that's what this show is telling us. It's saying that it's okay to question things, but you gotta do things your way. As long as it's in a respectful manner, of course. And that if you do so, and if you maintain your path, you do not have to resign yourself to fate. Yes, fate will be made regardless of what you do, but the less you resign yourself to it, the more actions you can take, the more agency you can exercise, and the better future you can create, not just for yourself, but for your loved ones and those around you. For society, really. I think that's why this show is a great show for its intended audience, because it can reach out to, perhaps more insecure people, or anyone really, and just say, you just need to be you. Everything is not going to be resolved overnight, but that's okay, because you can just be you, and use your own agency and figure yourself out and really take control of as much of your fate as you can, which is really what the series is telling us. It's telling us that yes, fate is out there, but it's up to us to make it. And welcome to the Vision of Escaflowne retrospective conclusion. A neat little capstone for the retrospective in which I do a few housekeeping things and share my final thoughts on the series. And thank you, the viewer, of course. Let's get into things. Now, the central theme of the series, as mentioned ad nauseum by this point, is defying the idea of an unchangeable fate and instead making your own. There are a few other themes that were worked into the series, though. However, these themes are just kind of generic and obvious. Things like war is bad and family is important. And since these themes are very general and not handled particularly gracefully or notably by the series, on occasion I would go as far to say clunkily, I didn't make videos on them as I felt that would be redundant and or unnecessary. In addition, the Fate video itself is sort of an amalgamation of ideas I had jotted down, including the ideas of predicting versus making the future, self-discovery, and moving on. I'd also like to say that there are other videos covering these topics made by people who are not me, and we should appreciate the time that they've put into them and give them a watch as well. While my ideas for the Fate video were not all the same, they were similar enough to lump them together, and since their topics have been mentioned in other videos, I didn't want to beat a dead horse too much. I also briefly considered making a video about the standalone movie. However, since that production is so alien to the source material, and honestly I didn't want to taint the fun energy of this series with a much darker movie, I decided to leave it alone for now, and probably come back to it at a later point, as a nice standalone feature. And that just about does it for the cut content section of this conclusion. Now to the best part, my final thoughts on the Vision of Escaflowne. Vision of Escaflowne surpassed all expectations I initially had of it. Just looking at the box and briefly glancing at a Wikipedia page about it, I expected, a competent, probably sanitized, generic adventure with a little bit of magic and theming, maybe an action scene, and generic positive, I guess. That's what I expected. I expected a generic family production, basically. What I got instead was an excellent series of episodes starring excellently written characters, real stakes, and deep themes applicable to both the cast and ourselves. In fact, while I understand Escaflowne is sometimes incorrectly dismissed as a chick flick because it stars a young woman, of all the series I've reviewed so far, with possibly the exception of Trigun or Samurai 7, I think the Vision of Escaflowne has the most broad appeal of any. The Big O is divisive due to its ending, Ergo Proxy is niche by default due to its philosophical overtones, and Blue Gender, of course, has a lot of gory, mature content. These are shows that, while I love, may not be for everyone. Everyone has different tastes. But I feel that Escaflowne is for everyone. It has great characters, it has a solid plot with high stakes, it has an enchanted setting, it has a smattering of amazing action scenes, it has romance, it has intrigue, it has an amazing soundtrack, and it has themes that hit close to home. And it manages to balance all of these very well. I'd like to point out that having all of these things alone is not necessarily an instant recipe for a perfect production. Each element must also be handled well in order to balance out and not overwhelm any other element, and Escaflowne does this masterfully. I think that's what sticks out the most to me, is how amazingly balanced the series is, of just how well-rounded it is. A good message, told by an amazing cast, in a wonderful setting, will automatically make for a great story. But, by managing to balance so many disparate components so expertly, they manage to craft a story which can have appeal to almost anyone. It's almost universal, if not universal. I want to just take a second here to really point out that Hitomi herself is a great protagonist and really shows that the writers knew what they were doing. I love the idea of the protagonist not necessarily being a combatant. It seems a little weird at first, but it does make the show so much more relatable. None of us are probably mech pilots in real life, and none of us are probably super skilled sword warriors. However, the main character of this show isn't either, and it shows that all of us can make our own destiny. It shows that all of us have agency and that we need to use it to make the best possible future for ourselves. I love the fact that Hitomi doesn't fight, actually. I've seen comments on some of my video about her saying that's what makes her so inspiring, that she is just like us, and that she still has the ability to change the future for the better. She doesn't fight, but she's still vital to the plot, and likable and relatable. And of course the rest of the cast is quite fleshed out too, and I'm amazed by how much they are so. While many of these characters could have simply been archetype tropes, they're not. They could have just used generic cold Folken, but no, he's an empathetic man struggling with his buried empathy. They could have just used a crazy generic warlord, but instead Dillandau is a mentally scarred young person who's trying to deal with a crap ton of trauma. They could have had generic knight in shining armor, but Alan's instead a deconstruction of what a knight really is and whether or not that actually affects who you are as a person. Vaughn could have just been generic sit-back prince, but instead he's a very active member of the cast who is by no means perfect. Millerna could have just been the damsel in distress, but she's a princess who actively tries to make her own future. And Dryden could have just been some merchant who doesn't care about anything but money, but he loves everything else at the expense of money. Escaflowne's writing is just so masterful, and its cast really adds to the universal appeal of the series, as they're simple enough in concept, as they're simple enough to understand and relate to, but fleshed out enough and written in a way that contradicts tropes to the point where they're still very interesting and engaging. Yes, there are productions with more action, or more romance, or more philosophical musings, or more characters written to fit certain roles, but Escaflowne and its cast and its soundtrack and just all of its elements have a little bit of something for everyone. And this masterful combination of so many different and interesting elements just establish Escaflowne as a truly, truly great obscure anime memory. I cannot recommend this series enough. I want to say thanks to all of those, of course, who watch my videos and who take time to comment and make show suggestions. In fact, Escaflowne was a viewer suggestion, and I'm grateful to be able to find and explore such obscure gems with the help of viewers and subscribers. Thanks to all those who have subscribed, by the way. Again, I thank everyone for subscribing and who enjoys these little videos. This is just a neat little hobby that I have, and it's just so cool seeing people who love all these other series that many don't even know about or hear about anymore. I think it's just so great exploring such obscure little gems. For now, though, I think I'm gonna call it. Once again, thank you to everyone for watching, thank you to everyone who's subscribed, and thanks for joining me as we explore some great, obscure anime memories.